A young mother of 5 is gunned down in broad daylight.
She was shot 14 times.
You can literally see the dirt kicking up from the bullets going through her body.
And it doesn't seem like an isolated incident.
There was a capital murder there the day before.
There was the same MO in both of these shootings.
As witnesses emerge, a picture of the shooter comes into focus.
She made eye contact with their killer.
He looked up at me and like, I'll kill you too.
But the secrets behind her murder won't stay buried.
He always used to sneak and hit her.
I didn't believe it when they told me.
He was just cold-hearted.
How long will he run before the truth catches up?
Police knew just how dangerous this person was.
Carefully view all the photographs.
You want to get him apprehended as quickly as possible?
There's only one that might be close to it.
They have the witnesses that are able to identify him.
Now the problem is, how do we find him?
September 23, 2021. It's Thursday morning in Houston, Texas, the nation's 4th largest city.
There are about 5 million people in the greater Houston area, and you can drive 2 hours and still be in Harris County.
It's the largest county population-wise in Texas. It's probably about the size of the whole entire state of New Jersey.
And just before noon this morning, calls from an apartment complex on the northern edge of the city start flooding into Harris County 911.
Quiet, man, we need police over here. I hear multiple gunshots. Dude just shot the girl. There's a lady on the ground, face down. I think she's dead. He shot her like 6 times.
When first responders arrive on the scene, they find the victim, 27-year-old Rhynisha Sanford, face down on the ground.
My baby was laying on the ground, fighting for her life.
This is in the middle of the day with dozens of people around.
What happened?
Rhynisha Sanford had always been a fierce protector of the people she loved.
She was the one who's not afraid to speak up. Like, when something was wrong, she'll let people know. She defended us.
Everybody looked up to her.
She was a loving, caring person. She made sure everybody around her was good.
And there was nobody Rhynisha loved more than her children.
When she became a mother, she was proud.
She had 5 kids, beautiful kids, a son, 4 girls.
She was a loving, caring parent. Her kids was everything to her.
Her kids never went without. They loved her. That was their best friend.
Originally from Baton Rouge, Rhynisha's family moved to Houston when she was 11 years old.
Houston offered more.
She like, Mom, I'm not coming back to Louisiana.
And it was there that Rhynisha truly blossomed.
She was very known. Everybody loved her, you know, and she was very popular.
She was the life of party. She loved to get dressed, loved new clothes, shoes. Anytime a new shoe come out, she had to get it.
She was a beautiful person. I see that smile and that gap teeth. That's my baby. She make her own beat, her own tune, but she was just her.
Finding someone to share her vibrant life with had proved challenging, though not for lack of trying.
She had 5 kids, and all her baby daddies, they involved in their kids' life.
But her luck seemed to change when she met Cameron Davis.
Hey.
What you got going on, girl?
She met him online.
He just seemed like cool.
The relationship quickly took off.
They just spoke on the phone all day, every day, fell asleep on the phone. Just FaceTiming and texting, like 2 teenagers.
Cameron and Rhynisha bonded over their similar roots in Louisiana.
Rhynisha was from Baton Rouge. He's from New Orleans.
There's an interesting relationship between Louisiana and Houston, all of Texas, but mainly Houston. You will find so many people who are Louisiana transplants or who have family from Louisiana.
Cameron moved to the Houston area following Katrina.
I'm just thinking about home. You know, sometimes I miss it, you know?
Yeah, I feel that.
I could just imagine that when she met someone else who was from similar upbringing, there was that immediate connection.
You look like you've been tired a little bit today.
Yeah, I guess I should be getting some sleep.
Girl, you can give me 5 more minutes.
Despite the sparks flying between them, the relationship still had its share of complications.
For one thing, Cameron had been in and out of trouble with the law.
He already had this violent history, and he had been convicted on an aggravated robbery.
But at the end of the day, his sordid past didn't affect the love Rainisha felt.
There's always been this long-standing idea about the bad boy and being intrigued by that, especially when you're in your 20s and you want to feel like passion.
She said she grown. I told her, you're right, you is grown. You know, she young, she in love, that's her man.
This was the love of her life.
But now first responders have found Rainisha gunned down in the parking lot of a Houston apartment complex.
Investigators realized, oh wow, this is a very violent shooting.
She was shot 14 times, but tragically, it was just too late.
"27-year-old Rainisha Sanford had built a beautiful life for her family in Houston, Texas.
She had 5 beautiful kids, a son, and 4 girls.
When it came down to her kids, she was very devoted.
And she'd fallen in love with a man named Cameron Davis.
They were always together. When they weren't together, they were on the phone. They were just head over heels.
But now, Rainisha's life has come to a sudden, violent end.
After reports of a shooting at a suburban Houston apartment complex, sheriff deputies found her dead from multiple gunshot wounds.
She was shot 14 times.
7 9mm shell casings are on the ground just above her head, and nearby, officers locate 11 more.
This was a very violent way to kill someone.
It was pretty clear that whoever did this was standing over her and had fired several shots into her while she was on the ground.
As detectives arrive, they're just as shocked by the brutality.
The shooting itself was a level of violence that you're not accustomed to dealing with, whether it be a district attorney or a homicide investigator.
They call this overkill because it's like, you know this person is gone, but for some reason, you feel like you have to harm their body even more.
Even more suspicious, this isn't the first shooting at this location that week.
There was a capital murder there the day before as well, where the 2 people got shot.
Around 9:30 the previous morning, Harris County 911 had received another flurry of calls reporting gunshots at the same apartment complex.
When sheriff's deputies arrived, they found 27-year-old Isaiah McCoy on the ground next to his vehicle.
He died from multiple gunshot wounds.
And 30-year-old Reginald J.J. Jackson was dead in the street just outside the complex.
He'd been shot and run over by a vehicle.
Surveillance footage from the property showed a man approach the 2 victims while they were in the parking lot.
The man then shoots McCoy multiple times.
It was a close-range shooting.
But Jackson took off running.
There was somewhat of a chase.
As Jackson reached the street, the shooter caught up with him.
He gunned Jackson down before returning to the apartment complex and disappearing from the camera's view.
Moments later, an SUV sped out of the complex, struck Jackson where he lay on the street, and then drove off.
There was somewhat of the same MO in the pattern of violence that happened in both of these shootings.
It's not common to hear about a deadly double shooting at an apartment complex, and then the very next day, you hear about another deadly shooting.
What if she had some sort of connection to McCoy and Jackson? Or maybe she was a witness that could identify their shooter.
Before investigators can check the surveillance footage to see if they can ID Rainisha's killer, they speak with a woman who claims to have seen the whole ordeal.
I was out there drinking my coffee and stuff, and I noticed them kind of getting into a dispute.
One of the people she describes was Rainisha. The other was a clean-cut black male.
The man was wearing a white t-shirt, light pants, and black slides with socks. And he was holding a gun.
The witness claims that she overheard the man trying to convince Rainisha to get back into the car.
Here, come on! Come on, get in the car!
He had like her flip-flops,
So
and he tossed them back to her, and she was scared to even pick those up.
The witness said the woman was terrified. It was as if she did not want to take her eyes off of him to get the shoots.
But then, the gunman noticed her watching.
He looked up at me, and I was like, don't. And he's just kind of like, I'll kill you too.
To make eye contact with that killer was very scary. Even scarier now that the person knows where they live at.
She was terrified of retaliation and retribution at a future date.
That's when the witness says she started gathering up her things to go back inside.
She said she figured it wasn't any of her business.
But before she could get inside, the man took action.
All of a sudden, she's running and he's shooting at me.
She sees this man shoot this woman several times, and I just can't imagine the fear she must have felt.
The witness describes the weapon as a small 9mm with an extended magazine.
This explains how the shooter was able to fire so many rounds at Rainisha.
After the shooting, the man abandoned the car and took off on foot.
He allegedly ran between the buildings towards a nearby gas station.
With no time to waste, police follow his route.
Officers are able to find another eyewitness.
A gas station employee believes they saw the shooter.
He matches his physical description. He's on the run.
This guy needed to be apprehended as soon as possible.
Not long after the murder of 27-year-old Rainisha Sanford, it seems Houston police are hot on the shooter's trail.
There is a witness who saw the gunman flee on foot in the direction of the gas station. So investigators followed his path.
An employee at the gas station told officers that a man with a gun had run across their parking lot.
The surrounding areas want to know what's happening in their community. Is this something that they should be concerned for their safety?
Luckily, the employee saw where the man went next.
This witness last saw him running, going to nearby apartments.
police locate that individual and bring him in custody.
However, as they talk to the man, they quickly realize it's just a dead end.
He was cleared. He was not the assailant in this case.
But as law enforcement continues to canvass the area, they do locate what appears to be the murder weapon.
Officers are able to find surveillance behind a nearby corner store.
The camera was able to capture the suspect, taking the magazine out of the gun and disposing of them separately.
Officers were able to go out and recover them, and so now we have the murder weapon.
Meanwhile, the investigation at the crime scene is ongoing.
The car that the eyewitness saw the shooter and Rainisha get out of is still in the parking lot.
The car has out-of-state plates.
Inside was a fast food bag, some cups, and a cell phone.
Leaving the car for the CSI team, detectives make their way to the apartment's main office.
They want to know what, if anything, had been captured on the complex's security cameras.
The apartment complex had installed surveillance cameras where they can pretty much see everything that's going on in the property.
Having a video itself is unique, you know? I mean, thank God for the video, right? Because you've got this sort of credibility.
Not only does a review of the footage confirm much of what the witness told them, it also reveals new details.
There's no doubt in what you're going to see on video versus what an eyewitness can maybe sometimes forget to report, or they didn't see the full situation.
On the surveillance video, you can see her get out of the car and then him get out as well.
Then he had started pulling the gun out, and she went running and hollering for help.
You see Miss Sanford run around that apartment complex for the better part of 20 minutes.
And you see where he shoots her again and again and got closer so he could be over her. He shot her like 5 times in the head.
The shooting itself takes place really far away, but it's really horrific.
The building's maintenance man tells detectives that he's seen the gunman and the victim around the complex before.
In fact, he said the gunman was around the day before when the double murder occurred, hanging around Building 20.
But does that mean that Rainisha's murder had something to do with the deaths of McCoy and Jackson?
We have 2 men who are shot and killed, very similar to how Rainisha was executed when she was murdered. Is this drugs? Is this gang? Are they connected?
He also tells detectives of a strange encounter between a carpet cleaning crew and the victim earlier that day.
They told him something happened, but he didn't have many details. So he gave them the company's information, and the detectives give them a call.
And the story the workman tells is shocking.
He said they were working on an apartment, and they say Rainisha ran in and hid behind the door.
And the reason for her fear quickly became apparent.
The next thing they know, a man came in with a gun.
And he points the gun at them as well.
He says they fled into one of the back rooms.
They were in fear for their life and also unsure of how to protect Rainisha in the moment.
If you're a third party and you see something like this, it's best not to intervene yourself.
From the back room, they said they could hear the man with the gun yelling at the woman.
He demanded, Rainisha to leave the apartment.
This went on a couple of minutes before they both left.
Ya cuando sucedieron, ¿qué hicieron ustedes?
Empezamos a hacer el trabajo lo más rápido para salirnos de él.
But ultimately, they hear those gunshots moments after.
As detectives wrap up at the scene, they're approached by a woman.
Excuse me? Detectives?
Ma'am, you're not allowed to be over here.
No, I'm family. Like, I need to talk to you.
She tells detectives that Rhanisha had been in an on-off relationship that had become abusive.
I don't know, she would just call him King.
Detectives investigating the shooting that killed Rhanisha Sanford have learned from a family member that the 27-year-old was in an abusive relationship.
She didn't know his real name, only that he goes by King.
King? She never talked about her relationship problems much. She got it all figured out, especially when it came down to a man.
No, all I know is it's not good.
Okay. All right, man. Well, thank you so much, okay? We'll take it from here.
To learn more about Rhanisha's relationships, detectives reach out to Rhanisha's mother, Ashley.
Rhanisha and her mom were very close. She was obviously devastated.
I'm her protector. I'm supposed to be there to save her, take care of her. It hurt. It hurts, man.
But through her grief, detectives get a name for King: Cameron Davis.
Apparently, the two of them had a very tumultuous relationship.
He always used to sneak and hit her. Like, I'm just going on what she used to tell me, was jealousy of her.
And it seemed the violence had only escalated.
He beat her up so bad where she couldn't go out. She was telling me, Mama, I'm tired. She knew she was about to die.
She tried to convince Rhanisha to leave Cameron.
I know what I've been through when I was young with domestic violence. So I know how to spot it. And I told her, take heed.
But on a visit to Houston to see Rhanisha and the kids, Ashley claims that she experienced Cameron's violence firsthand.
I had brought my grandson a cell phone.
What is this?
I just want to surprise little men when they got in.
Oh, I see what's going on. You don't think I can afford to get in one myself, huh?
What? No, I just...
He broke the cell phone.
You're gonna have to pay me for that.
I knew he was a bad person, and that's what made me leave Houston.
Despite her mother's best efforts, Rhanisha chose to stay with Cameron.
After that, I looked him up. I know he was a menace to society.
She found out that he had some warrants and was hoping they'd lock him up.
I feel like if I would have stayed, I could have prevented it from happening.
The rest of Rhanisha's family is equally devastated to learn of her death.
My sister called me. I said, well, Ashley, what's wrong? She said, my baby dead. And I went inside in my bathroom on the side of the bathtub. I'll never forget.
Everybody deals with death, but this type of death, it is painful. And then she had kids, she had little kids. It was just like unbelievable.
After talking to Rhanisha's mother, detectives run a search on Cameron's name.
In his background, he had a lot of violent crimes.
In fact, his criminal history dates back more than a decade.
Cameron Davis had previously been to prison for aggravated robbery.
But what seems especially relevant to detectives is the fact that Rhanisha had previously filed assault charges against Cameron.
In 2021, Cameron Davis was charged with 2 separate domestic violence cases, both involving Miss Sanford.
The first case happened in January.
The arrest happens in front of the hotel staff, and he tells the hotel staff, if you call the police, I'm gonna kill you, right? So that's a serious allegation in and of itself.
He was arrested, but he wasn't in jail long.
Everybody being legally entitled to a bond, he posted a bond and he stopped appearing for that case.
Although Rhynesha had managed to take out a protective order against Cameron.
But that didn't stop him from assaulting her again, only a few months later.
There's another case where Rhynesha had waved down to the police officers who saw her mouth and they see her busted lip, and she tells the police, Cameron did this to me, but he's gone off the scene.
So as you can see, it just continues to escalate.
A warrant was issued for Cameron's arrest.
And that case ultimately is still an open warrant when this murder tragically occurs.
When you see that someone has a criminal record of harming the victim, that makes them suspect number one and makes it clear to them where the investigation is heading.
Armed with Cameron's mugshot from his police file, detectives arranged to meet with the woman who witnessed the shooting.
They put together a photo spread and showed the witness to see if they can identify him as the subject.
Carefully view all the photographs. You are not obligated to identify anyone.
Detectives are in luck.
There's only one that might be close to it.
She was able to identify that that was, in fact, him, Cameron.
An eyewitness to the murder of Rhynesha Sanford has identified her boyfriend, Cameron Davis, as the man who shot her multiple times in a Houston apartment complex.
Her family had also informed detectives that Cameron was violent and abusive.
He was just cold-hearted. She did put restraining order on him. She got fed up with it.
Everything is in black and white within Cameron's police record.
When you see that someone has a history, a criminal record of violence or threats or harming the victim, that makes them suspect number one.
For Cameron Davis, he had 2 prior cases filed on him for this same type of behavior that we actually see escalating as well.
So detectives secure a warrant for his arrest.
They try to pick him up, but Cameron is not at any of his addresses. So the sheriff's office issues a bolo for him.
While officers work to track down Cameron, detectives follow another lead, thanks to the car he'd abandoned at the crime scene.
Police discover that the vehicle was a rental car.
Only the person who rented it wasn't Rhynesha or Cameron.
Yes, I'm calling about a blue sedan you rented.
It was a name detectives hadn't heard yet. But when they speak with her, she says she's a friend of Rhynesha's.
So I rented that car at first for my boyfriend, but he got arrested, so I let her use it.
That car was given to her for her use leading up to the shooting.
The friend also tells detectives that she spent a lot of time with Rhynesha recently.
She knew the history of the cycle of violence in their domestic relationship that they had been in.
Domestic violence happens primarily behind closed doors. A lot of the times it's not seen by your loved ones, but her friend is able to identify that cycle of power and control that she was trapped in.
She knew more about what Rhynesha was dealing with than we did because she was actually right there. She witnessed it more than us.
And less than 2 weeks before the murder, she says Rhynesha called her and asked for a ride to the emergency room.
She told me King had shot her.
She doesn't know exactly what happened, only that she'd shown up at Rhynesha's place and found her with a bloody towel wrapped around her right arm.
He shot her somewhere around the elbow.
Rhynesha was even less forthcoming with the doctors.
She didn't want to report that at the hospital.
the emergency room told her they would have to make a police report due to a gunshot wound. That was her moment to be able to share that X, Y, and Z is happening to me behind the scenes, but she couldn't, which tells me she was in fear of her life.
Her friend also confirms that Rhynisha was with Cameron on Thursday morning.
She was able to tell them that moments before the shooting, she was on the phone with Rhynisha.
Hey, girl. I didn't know King was in the car with her.
Thinking that she's just chatting with her friend, she mentions another man.
Then she heard Cameron in the background.
Who is Mello?
Cameron even grabbed the phone.
But nobody. Now you better come and get your girl back here.
Then he hung up.
About 20 minutes later, 911 calls start coming in to report a shooting.
When detectives follow up on the friend's statement, they do find a police report regarding the previous shooting incident.
She left the emergency room department before they got the name, but the report was still filed.
Then Rhynisha's autopsy report comes in, also confirming the injury.
The report refers to a healing defect on her right arm.
It also lays bare the sheer brutality of her murder.
It's not just that he shot her once in the back. He shot her again and again and again.
One of those bullets transected her spinal cord. She was not able to brace herself as her body fell against the pavement.
I think his only mission was to make sure that she stayed unalive.
However, the detectives are still no closer to finding Cameron.
Houston is so large, and there's so many violent crimes. The police only have a certain amount of resources, do surveillance and all the things necessary to track down an individual. So the community is going to be on edge because you got your families living in these places. You got your kids that you want to be able to play outside. They can't play outside because police are trying to find the suspect that just possibly killed this person.
Weeks turn into months with no sign of the fugitive.
When you have someone who's a violent offender like Cameron Davis, you want to get him apprehended as quickly as possible.
Now the problem is, how do we find him?
More than a year after Rhynisha Sanford's brutal murder, Houston police are still searching for their prime suspect, her boyfriend, Cameron Davis.
He's the abusive boyfriend who has 2 or 3 open warrants for assaulting her already.
There's also a witness who identifies Cameron as the man who shot Rhynisha more than a dozen times.
Cameron was the main suspect, but now the problem is, how do we find him?
For the better part of 15 months, he's on the run from these charges.
During that time, though, investigators arrest the shooter in the unrelated murders of Reginald Jackson and Isaiah McCoy.
For Rhynisha's family, the wait for justice feels never-ending.
It's very hard for a family to continue to live a normal life, not only after losing a loved one, but knowing that the suspect that committed the crime is out there running around free.
It affected my mama because it's just, he could be anywhere. Why is he free living his life? Why don't nobody care? I just kept wishing somebody would kill him the way he killed my sister.
But then in December of 2022, Houston Crime Stoppers gets a call.
Crime Stoppers is a very, very valuable program that the police started some years ago. They offer reward money for tips leading to arrest.
His roots go back to Louisiana. So Cameron supposedly was going back and forth between Louisiana and Houston.
They was on it, ready to go, like a breakthrough camp.
Following the tip, detectives are finally able to place Cameron under arrest.
I can only imagine that for everyone involved, once they heard that he was arrested, the relief that they must have felt.
There was victory.
But while Cameron's arrest offers the family a shot at closure, he doesn't give them any satisfaction.
Usually, you're looking for a reason why. Why did you do this? A statement of some sort. But Cameron refused to talk.
Defendants are not required to give a statement to the police. It's their Fifth Amendment right to not do so. So when someone is arrested but doesn't give a statement, it gives them flexibility as far as the evidence at trial to craft their defense to whatever they think the evidence will show.
In custody, he remains silent. But that's hardly a setback for the prosecution.
Each one of these pieces of evidence means a lot. When you have the gun, when you have the ballistic report, when they connect the blood to the subject, along with videotape and eyewitnesses, that's just a great line of evidence to have to show a jury.
But while the evidence in this case was strong, you can never take a verdict for granted because you never know what a jury will do.
When the case goes to trial in April of 2024, the prosecutors paint Cameron as a man consumed by rage.
We don't know exactly why Cameron Davis did what he did. However, with these domestic violence situations, whenever the victim is trying to leave, that is usually when the assailant has this mind frame of, if I can't have you, no one else can.
Investigators believe the initial trigger was Rainisha's phone call with her friend.
Hey, girl. I played a mellow for you. Oh, for real?
Who is Mellow?
Well, you let me finish, you can see it was nobody.
He only got angrier, and Rainisha ran from the car to escape him.
But Cameron refused to let it go.
Are you gonna come and get your gun? Get back here!
Instead of letting things cool off, he chased her through the apartment complex.
And that's what sets off this sort of tortuous 20 minutes where she's running for her life. We're able to see on surveillance Miss Sanford running around that apartment complex in what we can only really imagine is abject terror.
He hunted her down.
He ultimately cornered her in the apartment where the carpet cleaners were working.
On the way back to the car, her nightmare continued.
Come on! Come on! Cameron! Come on! No, Cameron, no, please! Here, come get in the car! Get in the car! What am I supposed to do with all these cameras out here?
He threw her shoes at her, and she's so scared that she actually hesitated to even get closer to get them.
Shut up! I'll kill you too! Oh my God, Cameron! Oh my God, make me, please! Come on! Cameron, please! Oh my God!
That will always stick with me, just knowing that in those moments right before her death, she was literally begging for her life.
When he saw her lifeless body fall to the ground, he still extended more rounds into her body.
The defense tries to claim that the investigators got the wrong man.
When the defense says that's not Cameron Davis on the video, we were able to loop in all of the prior instances of violence, the fact that they were in this relationship that was so toxic and on again, off again, the fact that her friend is able to identify Cameron's voice, as well as those witnesses who were there in the courtyard.
Considering the amount of evidence against him, the prosecutors have no trouble convincing the jury that Cameron murdered Rainisha.
In this case, the jury ultimately returned a verdict of guilty.
He now is serving a life sentence with eligibility for parole after 30 years.
While the verdict of life itself is what I believe to be justice, just based on the level of violence that Cameron Davis demonstrated, I know that that verdict will never bring Miss Sanford back.
It's equally bittersweet for Rainisha's family.
They say justice was served, but to me, justice would never be served.
He shouldn't see the lights of day no.
Like I said, I wanted him to die. I just felt like jail's way too easy.
I want you to suffer like how we do. We got to go every day. I want you to do the same thing. Suffer. That's it.
But there's no sentence, no matter how harsh, that will make up for how much Rainisha's family and her children miss her.
I'm gonna be honest, I would never be okay. She is missed so much.
She was my best friend. That's who made me who I am today. And I'm trying to stay strong. The kids I see every day, I watch them grow every day. I can't give them what their mama can give them. And that's mama love.
Abuse is never okay. If you or someone you love is in an abusive relationship, there is help available. Call.
On a cold autumn morning in November 1970, the silence of a quiet Pennsylvania neighborhood was shattered by a discovery that would haunt investigators for generations. There were no screams in the darkness, no frantic calls for help that anyone could remember, no eyewitness who could later stand before a courtroom and point to the face of a killer. There was only a teenage girl who never made a home, a family whose ordinary evening became the beginning of an endless nightmare, and a murder investigation that would remain suspended in time for decades. Even today, the echoes of that morning refuse to disappear. In communities like this, violent crime was something people watched on the evening news, something that happened somewhere else. Parents left their doors unlocked. Teenagers walked familiar streets without fear. Neighbors knew one another by name, and unfamiliar cars attracted attention. The illusion of safety was powerful, built over years of routine and trust. But all it takes is one night, one unseen predator, one brief encounter, to destroy that illusion forever. Pamela Conyers was still in high school, standing at the threshold between adolescence and adulthood. Friends remembered her as cheerful, responsible, and full of plans that stretched far beyond graduation. She had dreams like countless other teenagers of her generation, dreams that seem almost guaranteed simply because youth itself carries an expectation of tomorrow. Nobody around her imagined those dreams would end abruptly, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions. The day itself had offered no warning. Nothing appeared unusual. Conversations were ordinary. The routines of school, family, and friends unfolded exactly as they had dozens of times before. There were assignments to finish, places to be, people to meet. If anyone had looked closely, they would have seen only another ordinary American teenager living another ordinary day. That normality is precisely what makes certain crimes so unsettling. Murder investigations often begin with obvious fractures, domestic disputes, threats, jealous lovers, financial motives, visible conflicts. Detectives know where to begin because the violence grows from something already broken. But in cases like Pamela's, there was no clear fracture waiting to be examined. The violence seemed to emerge from nowhere, as though the killer had stepped briefly into existence, carried out the crime with chilling efficiency, and vanished again without leaving behind an identity. As evening settled across the neighborhood, concern slowly replaced routine. Pamela failed to return when expected. At first, the delay did not appear alarming. Teenagers lose track of time. Conversations run long. Plans change without notice. Parents reassure themselves with ordinary explanations because the extraordinary is almost impossible to imagine. Minutes became hours. Phone calls produced no answers. Friends had not seen her. Relatives knew nothing. An uncomfortable uncertainty settled over the household. Eventually, concern transformed into fear. By the time authorities became involved, every passing minute mattered. Search efforts began with hope. Officers canvassed nearby streets. Volunteers looked through vacant lots, wooded areas, drainage ditches, and places where someone might have become injured or stranded. Flashlights pierced the darkness while anxious voices called Pamela's name repeatedly into the night. There was no response. Every unsuccessful hour deepened the growing realization that investigators were dealing with something far more serious than a missing person report. Then came the discovery. The scene immediately told experienced investigators that this was no accident. It was no runaway. It was no misunderstanding. A homicide investigation had begun. The first responding officers understood that every footprint, every tire impression, every fiber, every discarded object could become crucial evidence. Crime scene tapes stretched across the area as detectives began documenting every visible detail. Photographers captured images from every conceivable angle. Evidence technicians moved slowly, carefully, determined not to disturb even the smallest clue. Yet despite all their experience, something immediately troubled investigators. The scene offered remarkably little. There were no obvious signs identifying the killer. No wallet dropped in panic. No weapon abandoned nearby. No handwritten note. No immediate witness stepping forward with a license plate or a recognizable face. The person responsible had either been extraordinarily lucky or frighteningly careful. Medical examiners examined Pamela's injuries with painstaking precision, searching for anything that might reveal the sequence of events. Every bruise, every wound, every trace evidence sample represented another piece of a puzzle whose final image remained invisible. The examination established one devastating certainty. Pamela had not simply disappeared. Someone had intentionally taken her life. News spread rapidly throughout the community. Parents who had once encouraged independence suddenly insisted their children stay indoors before sunset. School administrators held meetings with frightened families. Local newspapers devoted prominent headlines to the murder. Television stations interrupted regular programming with updates as reporters attempted to answer the same haunting question everyone else was asking. Who could have done this? Rumors emerged almost immediately. Some believed the killer had to be someone local. Others insisted an unknown drifter passing through town was responsible. Speculation spread faster than verified facts. Every unfamiliar face attracted suspicion. Every strange vehicle became a possible lead. Every inconsistency in someone's story generated whispers. Detectives understood the danger of rumor. Public fear often creates dozens, sometimes hundreds, of false leads that consume valuable investigative time. Nevertheless, every phone call required attention because genuine information sometimes hides among confusion. The investigation expanded rapidly. Friends were interviewed. Teachers were questioned. Neighbors described everything they had noticed during the preceding days. Businesses along nearby roads were visited. Employees attempted to remember unusual customers. Gas stations checked receipts. Taxi drivers answered questions. School records were reviewed. Investigators attempted to reconstruct Pamela's final known movements minute by minute. Every confirmed sighting became another point on an increasingly complicated timeline. But timelines can be deceptive. They reveal only what witnesses remember. Human memory is imperfect, especially after trauma. One witness might confidently recall seeing someone wearing a dark jacket. Another insists it was light-colored. One person remembers the time as shortly after sunset. Another believes it was nearly an hour later. Detectives had to separate confidence from accuracy. That process would become increasingly difficult as days turned into weeks. The forensic technology available in 1970 imposed severe limitations. Crime scene investigators collected fingerprints whenever possible. Hair samples, fibers, biological material, soil, photographs, everything that contemporary science could examine. Yet laboratories of the era simply lacked many of the analytical capabilities investigators now take for granted. Evidence that today might identify a suspect within days often remained frustratingly silent decades ago. Still, detectives refused to surrender. They built profiles, created maps, pinned photographs across office walls, drew connections between interviews, compared statements repeatedly. They looked for contradictions, hidden relationships, unexplained absences, forgotten acquaintances. One detective later remarked that investigations often resemble assembling a 1,000-piece puzzle without knowing whether all the pieces even belong to the same picture. Pamela's case seemed exactly like that. Every promising lead dissolved. Every potential suspect appeared to have an explanation. Every breakthrough faded under closer examination. Some investigators believed the murder was random. Others suspected someone familiar to the victim. Neither theory produced enough evidence to justify an arrest. As weeks passed, another enemy quietly entered the investigation. Time. Witnesses forgot details. Memories blended with newspaper reports. Physical evidence deteriorated. Potential suspects moved away. Vehicles changed ownership. Records disappeared. The urgency that defines the first days of every homicide investigation slowly yielded to the exhausting persistence required for a long-term case. For Pamela's family, however, nothing became routine. Each sunrise reopened the wound. Each unanswered question became heavier. Birthdays arrived without celebration. Holidays became reminders of absence. An empty chair around the dinner table transformed into a permanent symbol of everything that had been stolen. Families of homicide victims often describe time differently. The calendar continues moving. Life around them continues. Neighbors return to ordinary routines. News cameras disappear. Headlines fade. But inside the family home, the crime never truly ends. Every knock at the door carries impossible hope. Every unexpected telephone call briefly raises a question no one dares ask aloud. Could this finally be the answer? The investigators carried a similar burden. Boxes of reports accumulated. Photographs yellowed with age. Interview transcripts filled filing cabinets. Names once considered highly suspicious gradually lost significance. New detectives inherited the case from retiring colleagues, studying decades-old notes written by officers they had never met. Each generation believed it might notice something overlooked by the previous one. Sometimes fresh eyes solve old crimes. Sometimes they simply discover how many questions remain unanswered. Pamela Conyers' murder was steadily becoming what every detective fears most, a cold case. Not because investigators had stopped caring. Not because the family had given up searching. But because every obvious path had already been explored, every immediate lead exhausted, and every certainty dissolved into doubt. Somewhere beyond the evidence already collected, someone still carried the truth. Whether that person was a killer, an unnoticed witness, or someone who had remained silent out of fear, guilt, or loyalty, investigators could not know. They only knew that the answers existed somewhere outside the growing stacks of reports inside the evidence room. And as another winter settled over the community, the silence surrounding Pamela's final hours became almost as frightening as the crime itself, leaving behind a question that would endure far longer than anyone could have imagined. By the time the first weeks of the investigation gave way to the first months, the atmosphere inside the Detective Bureau had changed completely. The frantic urgency that defines every fresh homicide had settled into something heavier, methodical persistence mixed with growing frustration. Every wall seemed covered with maps, handwritten notes, black and white photographs, interview summaries, and timelines that stretched from one end of the room to the other. Detectives had reconstructed Pamela Conyers' final known movements so many times that they could recite them from memory. Yet the one piece that mattered most, the identity of the person who intercepted her path, remained invisible. Cold cases rarely become cold because investigators stop working. They become cold because every logical direction eventually reaches a dead end. Pamela's case was no different. Every person who had spoken with her during the final days of her life became part of the investigation. Friends were interviewed repeatedly. Teachers were asked whether they had noticed any unusual behavior. Classmates tried to remember conversations that had seemed completely insignificant at the time. Family members retraced every detail of the days leading up to her disappearance, searching for something they might have overlooked. The answers were painfully ordinary. No major arguments. No known enemies. No obvious threats. No dramatic confrontation that could explain why a young high school student had become the victim of such extraordinary violence. To detectives, that absence of motive was deeply unsettling. Murders driven by jealousy, revenge, money, or domestic conflict usually leave emotional footprints. Someone talks. Someone loses control. Someone threatens violence beforehand or behaves strangely afterward. Investigators know where to focus because human emotion rarely remains hidden forever. Random violence is different. It creates chaos instead of patterns. If Pamela had crossed paths with a stranger, a predator who selected victims based purely on opportunity, the investigation suddenly expanded from a circle of acquaintances to virtually anyone who happened to be in the area that day. That possibility transformed an already difficult investigation into an overwhelming one. Officers began reviewing reports of suspicious activity from neighboring communities. Patrol logs were examined line by line. Any complaint involving harassment, attempted abduction, indecent exposure, or unexplained encounters suddenly acquired new significance. Perhaps someone had reported a suspicious vehicle. Perhaps another young woman had escaped an attack. Perhaps another police department had encountered an individual whose behavior now appeared connected. Each report became another thread. Most led nowhere. Some appeared promising for a few days before collapsing under closer examination. The uncertainty weighed heavily on everyone involved. Residents who had never considered locking their doors before bedtime suddenly developed new habits. Parents changed family routines almost overnight. Teenagers were instructed not to walk alone after school. Evening activities ended earlier than usual. Community organizations organized neighborhood meetings where fear circulated as freely as speculation. Questions filled every conversation. Was the killer local? Had he already left town? Would he strike again? No one could answer with confidence. That uncertainty often produces a kind of fear more powerful than certainty itself. People can prepare for a known danger. An unknown one lingers everywhere. The media amplified that anxiety. Local newspapers followed the investigation closely, publishing updates whenever detectives announced new interviews or appealed for additional witnesses. Headlines emphasized the mystery surrounding the murder. Reporters spoke with neighbors, classmates, and community leaders, attempting to understand how such a crime could occur in a place long considered safe. Public attention brought both advantages and complications. On one hand, widespread coverage encouraged witnesses to come forward. On the other, publicity generated an avalanche of misinformation. Telephone calls flooded the police department. Some callers genuinely believed they possessed valuable information. Others repeated rumors heard from neighbors. Anonymous accusations appeared with alarming frequency. Every former boyfriend became suspicious in someone's eyes. Every outsider passing through town attracted speculation. Every person who behaved awkwardly suddenly found themselves a subject of whispered conversations. Detectives could not afford to dismiss any lead outright. Every allegation required at least some level of verification. Resources stretched thin. Investigators drove hundreds of miles conducting interviews that ultimately revealed nothing. Background checks multiplied. Employment records were reviewed. Vehicle registrations examined. Travel histories reconstructed whenever possible. One name after another entered the investigative file. One name after another was eventually crossed out. Sometimes the reason was simple. The individual possessed a solid alibi. Sometimes physical evidence excluded them. Sometimes investigators simply discovered no credible connection whatsoever. The list of possibilities grew shorter. The mystery remained exactly the same. The crime scene itself continued offering only limited guidance. Forensic specialists revisited collected evidence repeatedly, hoping fresh examination might reveal details overlooked during the initial processing. Every preserved item was carefully cataloged. Clothing, trace materials, photographs, and laboratory reports remained securely stored because experienced investigators understood one important principle. Science changes. Evidence does not. A sample considered insignificant today may become invaluable tomorrow. Although no one could predict the remarkable advances forensic science will experience over the coming decades, conscientious detectives preserved virtually everything they could. That decision would later prove essential. But during those early years, progress remained painfully slow. Meanwhile, behavioral analysis became increasingly important. Experienced homicide investigators began asking different questions. What kind of offender commits a crime like this? Was the attack planned? Impulsive? Sexually motivated? Did the killer know the victim beforehand? Or was Pamela simply in the wrong place at the worst possible moment? Each possibility suggested a different investigative strategy. If the offender knew Pamela personally, detectives needed to identify hidden relationships. If the crime was opportunistic, they needed to understand who had access to the area. If it reflected a serial predator's behavior, investigators had to determine whether similar attacks had occurred elsewhere. The answers remained elusive. Criminal profilers, though far less common than they would become in later decades, often emphasize that offenders reveal themselves through patterns rather than isolated acts. Patterns. The word became central to the investigation. Detectives searched surrounding counties for comparable assaults. Unsolved attacks involving young women. Disappearances. Attempted kidnappings. Cases sharing unusual characteristics. Whenever similarities appeared, investigators exchanged reports with neighboring jurisdictions. Sometimes the resemblance proved superficial. Sometimes timelines failed to match. Sometimes suspects already in custody eliminated possible connections. Still, detectives refused to ignore any possibility. Better pursue 10 false connections than overlook one genuine one. Pamela's family experienced an entirely different battle. Public attention meant strangers recognized their names. Journalists requested interviews. Neighbors expressed sympathy. Well-meaning acquaintances asked questions that reopen emotional wounds every single day. Grief became public. Privacy disappeared. Every newspaper article reminded the family that the investigation remained unsolved. Every anniversary revived the same unbearable reality. The house itself changed. Bedrooms remained untouched longer than anyone expected. Personal belongings became precious artifacts. Photographs acquired almost sacred importance because they preserved moments untouched by violence. Families living through homicide often describe an invisible divide. Life before. Life after. Nothing ever truly returns to normal. For detectives, the emotional toll manifested differently. Many investigators had children approximately Pamela's age. Some quietly admitted they began driving their own teenagers everywhere. Others checked on family members more frequently. Professional distance can never fully erase personal humanity. Every homicide victim reminds investigators that random violence ignores ordinary expectations. The department periodically reviewed the investigation from the beginning. Fresh teams examined original reports. Could the first detectives have overlooked something? Was there a contradiction buried inside hundreds of witness statements? Had someone lied convincingly enough to escape suspicion? Entire files were reread. Interview recordings replayed. Handwritten notes compared against official reports. Occasionally, investigators discovered small inconsistencies. A witness remembered a different time. Another corrected an earlier statement. A vehicle description changed slightly. Each inconsistency demanded further investigation. Most ultimately reflected nothing more sinister than than imperfect memory. Human recollection fades surprisingly quickly. Confidence often increases even as accuracy declines. Detectives understood the psychological reality, making eyewitness testimony both valuable and potentially misleading. Physical evidence remained far more dependable. Unfortunately, physical evidence spoke only when the available science allowed it. Months gradually became years. Personnel changed. Promotions occurred. Retirements followed. Young officers who had never met Pamela studied the case as though investigating a stranger from another era. Senior detectives handed over thick folders filled with observations impossible to summarize inside official paperwork. Pay attention to this witness. I never fully believed that statement. Something about this timeline still bothers me. Such informal knowledge often travels from one investigator to another like an unwritten inheritance. Cold cases survive because someone refuses to stop asking questions. Yet every passing year created new obstacles. Potential witnesses died. Businesses closed. Records disappeared. Memories blurred. Entire neighborhoods transformed through redevelopment. Landmarks referenced in original interviews no longer existed. Returning to the scene years later often meant standing inside an entirely different environment. Only the crime itself remained unchanged. The evidence room became a silent archive of unfinished justice. Boxes labeled with Pamela's name occupied shelves beside countless other investigations awaiting resolution. Each contained photographs, laboratory reports, interview transcripts, maps, evidence inventories, thousands upon thousands of pages documenting one unanswered question. Some detectives develop a habit of reopening the file late at night after finishing newer cases, not because they expected an immediate breakthrough, because unresolved murders possess an unusual gravity. They linger. Every experienced investigator understands that somewhere someone escaped accountability. That thought can become impossible to ignore. The community also changed with time. New families moved into neighborhoods unfamiliar with the tragedy. Children grew into adults who had only heard fragments of the story. For some residents, Pamela became less a person than a local legend, a name associated with warnings parents repeated to their children about being careful after dark. But for those who remembered November 1970 firsthand, the memories never became legends. They remained painfully real. They remembered the flashing police lights, the newspaper headlines, the nervous conversations across kitchen tables, the feeling that something fundamental had been stolen from their town. Safety, trust, certainty. Those losses cannot be measured in evidence logs or investigative reports. They endure quietly, shaping communities long after television cameras disappear. As another year passed without an arrest, investigators faced a difficult reality shared by every unsolved homicide squad. The case had reached a point where no obvious investigative path remained. Every established lead had been examined. Every immediate suspect had either been excluded or left unsupported by evidence. The file was far from closed, but progress had slowed to a crawl, leaving detectives with only one enduring hope: that somewhere in the future, whether through advancing forensic science, a forgotten witness, or the conscience of someone who had remained silent for far too long, the truth might finally find its way back into the light. Years have a way of changing almost everything. Streets are repaved, buildings disappear, children become parents, detectives retire, entire police departments adopt new technologies that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. Yet, in the evidence room, time seems to stop. Cardboard boxes remain sealed. Photographs slowly fade. Typewritten reports yellow around the edges. The labels stay the same. The questions stay the same. Pamela Conyers' homicide had reached that strange place where a case is no longer dominating newspaper headlines, but has never stopped occupying the minds of those responsible for solving it. To the public, silence often appears to mean inactivity. Inside law enforcement, silence usually means something entirely different. It means investigators are waiting. Waiting for technology. Waiting for another agency to share information. Waiting for a witness to change their mind. Waiting for a suspect to make a mistake. Waiting for time itself to loosen the grip of secrets that once seemed impossible to uncover. Veteran homicide detectives often say that killers believe they defeated the investigation the moment the headlines disappear. Many are wrong. Cold cases possess extraordinary patience. Unlike people, evidence never loses interest. The investigation into Pamela's murder entered the slower, more deliberate phase. Every few years, the file returned to the top of someone's desk. Fresh detectives approached the case without the assumptions that naturally develop during an original investigation. They weren't emotionally attached to early theories. They weren't influenced by old office politics or investigative rivalries. Their only responsibility was to ask one simple question. What if everyone before us missed something? That question has solved more than a few cold cases. The original witness interviews were examined once again. Some statements appear remarkably consistent despite the passage of time. Others revealed subtle contradictions that had received little attention during the initial investigation. A witness who originally claimed certainty about a timeline now admitted uncertainty. Another remembered details that had seemed insignificant decades earlier. A third quietly acknowledged they had withheld information out of fear. Not necessarily fear the killer, but fear of becoming involved in a homicide investigation. Human behavior changes over time. People who refuse to cooperate during the first weeks after a murder sometimes become surprisingly willing to speak decades later. Friendships dissolve. Families separate. Loyalties disappear. Fear weakens. Guilt grows heavier. Investigators understand this better than almost anyone. Time could become an ally. One by one, detectives revisited individuals connected to Pamela's life. Former classmates, old neighbors, teachers, employers, friends who had long since moved away. Some interviews took place hundreds of miles from Pennsylvania. Others required investigators to locate people whose names had changed through marriage or whose addresses had disappeared from public records. The conversations often began awkwardly. Most people had not discussed Pamela in years. Some became emotional almost immediately. Others struggled to remember details from so long ago. Memory is unpredictable. A person may forget an entire year of ordinary events, yet remember one strange encounter with astonishing clarity. Detectives encourage witnesses to focus not only on the day of the murder, but also on the days before it. Did Pamela ever mention someone making her uncomfortable? Did anyone seem unusually interested in her? Did any unfamiliar vehicle repeatedly appear near school? Had anyone displayed inappropriate attention toward teenage girls? Sometimes answers emerge slowly. A seemingly unrelated story. An odd conversation. A face remembered without a name. Each fragment entered the investigative record. Whether useful or not, nothing was dismissed outright. Meanwhile, forensic science continued evolving at an astonishing pace. The late 20th century witnessed revolutionary changes in criminal investigation. Laboratories developed increasingly sophisticated methods for examining microscopic evidence. Fingerprint databases expanded dramatically. Computers replaced handwritten filing systems. Evidence once considered impossible to analyze gradually became useful. Across the United States, police departments began reopening unsolved murders with renewed optimism. Cases abandoned for decades suddenly produced suspects. Names hidden by technological limitations resurfaced. Families who had nearly lost hope began receiving unexpected phone calls from detectives. Those successes encouraged agencies everywhere. If one 40-year-old murder could be solved, why not another? Pamela's file once again attracted renewed attention. Evidence technicians carefully inventoried every preserved item. Chain of custody documentation was reviewed to ensure materials had remained properly stored. Investigators knew an unfortunate truth. Even the most advanced forensic techniques become useless if evidence has been contaminated, misplaced, or improperly preserved. Fortunately, many homicide investigators from the 1970s had understood the importance of preservation, even though they could not predict future scientific advances. That foresight mattered enormously. Boxes that had remained untouched for years were reopened with extraordinary care. Each envelope, each sealed container, each photograph, each laboratory submission, everything was examined as though investigators were seeing it for the first time. Some evidence appeared exactly as expected. Some revealed details overlooked decades earlier. Improved photography and digital enhancement occasionally allowed analysts to observe features impossible to identify using earlier equipment. Tiny details suddenly became visible. Patterns emerged where none had been recognized before. None of these discoveries immediately identified Pamela's killer, but they strengthened one crucial belief: the case remained solvable. Detectives also expanded their focus beyond local jurisdictions. In 1970, communication between police departments often depended upon telephone calls, mailed reports, and personal relationships. Decades later, computerized databases transformed that process. Investigators could compare unsolved homicides across multiple states more efficiently than ever before. The question became increasingly important. Was Pamela's murder truly isolated? Or did it belong to a larger pattern that nobody recognized at the time? Analysts searched for similarities. Young female victims, comparable circumstances, geographic overlap, behavioral characteristics, offender methods. Sometimes similarities appeared compelling. Then differences emerged. Other times, entirely separate investigations reached out after noticing possible connections. Information flowed both directions. Most comparisons ultimately failed. Criminal behavior often resembles other crimes without sharing the same offender. Still, detectives refused to overlook any possibility. A single overlooked connection could transform the entire investigation. Public interest also experienced occasional resurgence. Every significant anniversary generated renewed media coverage. Local newspapers revisited the unsolved murder. Television reporters interviewed retired investigators. Journalists spoke with surviving family members, carefully balancing public curiosity against personal grief. The central question remained unchanged: who killed Pamela Conyers? Viewers watching decades after the crime often assumed the answer must already exist somewhere inside the investigative file. Reality proved far more frustrating. Experienced homicide detectives know that many unsolved murders possess enormous amounts of information: thousands of pages, hundreds of interviews, dozens of forensic reports, maps, photographs, timelines. The challenge is not the absence of information. It is determining which tiny piece actually matters. Somewhere inside countless details, one fact carries extraordinary significance. The difficulty lies in recognizing it. The emotional burden carried by Pamela's family never disappeared. Time softened certain wounds, but deepened others. Parents age. Siblings build families of their own. Grandchildren grow up hearing stories about an aunt they never had the opportunity to meet. Every milestone carries an invisible absence. Birthdays, graduations, weddings, holiday dinners. Each occasion quietly reminds surviving relatives of the future stolen decades earlier. For homicide survivors, justice is rarely about revenge. It is about answers, knowing, understanding, being able to replace endless uncertainty with documented truth. That hope remained alive despite the passing years. Retired detectives often admitted they continued thinking about Pamela's case long after leaving the department. Some maintained personal copies of investigative notes. Others followed every advancement in forensic science with growing optimism. Many believed that if the case were ever solved, it would likely happen through evidence collected before anyone realized its future value. That belief reflected an important lesson repeated across countless investigations. The killer may escape detection. The evidence remembers. Across America, cold case units increasingly embrace this philosophy. Rather than viewing unsolved murders as failures, investigators began treating them as investigations waiting for better tools. DNA analysis revolutionized countless cases. Fingerprint comparison improved dramatically. Digital record systems allowed connections impossible only a generation earlier. Every breakthrough elsewhere strengthened hope inside Pamela's investigation. Perhaps tomorrow would finally become the day. Yet optimism alone never solves murder. Detectives still needed evidence strong enough to survive judicial scrutiny. Speculation was worthless. Rumors meant nothing. Public opinion could not replace forensic proof. The standard remained unchanged. Investigators needed facts. Verifiable. Documented. Reliable. That commitment sometimes frustrated observers eager for quick answers. Police refused to identify persons of interest publicly without sufficient justification. Potential theories remained confidential. Evidence known only to investigators stayed protected because false confessions occasionally emerge in high-profile cases. Only the true offender would possess certain information. Keeping those details secret preserved the integrity of future interviews. As technology advanced into the 21st century, another important realization emerged. Many offenders had grown older. Some had died. Others lived ordinary lives, believing the past had been permanently buried. If Pamela's killer still remained alive, decades had likely transformed them physically. Hair had turned gray. Faces had aged. Families may have been established. Careers completed. Neighbors might describe them as perfectly ordinary. History repeatedly demonstrates an uncomfortable truth. Many violent offenders successfully hide behind ordinary appearances for years. The passage of time does not erase responsibility, nor does it erase evidence. Inside the department, investigators understood that cold cases often reach turning points unexpectedly. One anonymous letter. One laboratory result. One unrelated arrest. One family member deciding they could no longer remain silent. Entire investigations have changed direction because of a single conversation lasting only minutes. Hope therefore remained cautious but genuine. Not blind optimism. Professional persistence. The kind built upon experience rather than emotion. Somewhere beyond the aging case files, beyond decades of unanswered questions, beyond countless interviews and unsuccessful leads, investigators believed the truth still existed in a tangible form. Whether hidden inside preserved forensic evidence, buried within someone's long-suppressed memory, or waiting to emerge through scientific advances that earlier detectives could never have imagined, the possibility remained alive. And as another anniversary approached, the murder of Pamela Conyers stood not merely as an unsolved crime from the past, but as an active reminder that some investigations refuse to surrender, no matter how many years stand between the victim and the justice still waiting beyond the horizon. The investigation had entered a phase that every homicide detective understands, but every victim's family dreads. The frantic search was over. The obvious suspects had been questioned. The neighborhoods had been canvassed until there were no more doors left to knock on. Every newspaper clipping had been filed away. Every witness statement had been typed, reviewed, and reviewed again. What remained was something far more difficult than chasing a suspect. Waiting. Waiting for science to catch up. Waiting for memory to return. waiting for conscience to overcome silence. Inside police headquarters, Pamela Conyers' case never truly disappeared. It simply changed addresses. The thick investigative file was moved from the active homicide desk to the growing collection of unsolved murders, cases that refused to yield despite years of work. Detectives disliked the term cold case. It suggested abandonment. In reality, the file was anything but forgotten. Every so often, someone would pull the box from the shelf, spread the photographs across a conference table, read the reports from beginning to end, start over, again, and again. Experienced investigators know something younger detectives often learn the hard way. The evidence never changes. The investigator does. A detective who studies a case after 20 years of experience often notices details they completely overlooked during their first years on the job. A single sentence buried inside an interview transcript can suddenly carry enormous significance. A witness once dismissed as unreliable may appear surprisingly credible after other evidence is reconsidered. What once looked like coincidence may slowly begin to resemble a pattern. That philosophy guided every review of Pamela's murder. Nothing was considered too insignificant. Nothing was automatically accepted simply because earlier investigators believed it. Every assumption had to earn its place. The original timeline became the center of renewed attention. Investigators reconstructed Pamela's final known hours with almost obsessive precision. Where had she been? Who had seen her? At exactly what time? How certain were those witnesses? Could their memories be independently verified? Each answer generated another question. Some witnesses remained remarkably consistent even decades later. Others unknowingly introduced small inconsistencies. A few minutes gained. A few minutes lost. A location remembered differently. A vehicle recalled from another direction. None of those differences necessarily indicated deception. Human memory is remarkably fragile. Psychologists have demonstrated repeatedly that memory does not function like a video recording. People reconstruct events. Each recollection is influenced by time, emotion, conversations with others, newspaper articles, even television documentaries. Investigators therefore approached every interview carefully. Confidence did not equal accuracy. Sometimes the most uncertain witness turned out to be the most reliable. At the same time, detectives expanded their attention beyond Pamela herself. They began asking a broader question. What was happening in the region during that period? The late 1960s and early 1970s represented a period of enormous social change across the United States. Communities grew. Highways connected previously isolated towns. People traveled farther for work, school, and recreation than earlier generations had. Criminals benefited from that mobility just as ordinary citizens did. An offender no longer had to live near the victim. He could arrive, commit the crime, disappear, cross multiple county lines before sunrise. That possibility complicated every aspect of the investigation. Detectives reviewed reports from neighboring jurisdictions, then neighboring states. Any homicide involving a young female victim attracted attention. Any attempted abduction, any suspicious encounter, any unidentified offender. Information that once would have remained locked inside separate filing cabinets gradually became easier to compare. Most similarities ultimately proved superficial. But investigators refused to dismiss the possibility that Pamela's killer had offended elsewhere. Violent offenders often repeat behavior. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to leave recognizable patterns. Behavioral analysis had also become more sophisticated than it had been in 1970. Earlier investigators focused primarily on physical evidence. Modern detectives increasingly studied offender behavior, not to identify a specific individual, but to understand the type of individual they were searching for. Did the offender demonstrate planning, organization, impulse? familiarity with the area, confidence, experience. The crime itself became another witness. Every action taken by the offender reflected a decision. Every decision revealed something. Perhaps not a name, but a characteristic. One choice suggested preparation. Another suggested panic. The challenge was separating fact from interpretation. Good investigators resisted the temptation to force evidence into attractive theories. Theories are comforting. Evidence is demanding. Several working hypotheses emerged over the years. One suggested the killer may have known Pamela personally. Another argued she was selected because she happened to cross paths with a stranger. A third explored whether the offender possessed previous criminal experience that allowed him to avoid detection. Each possibility carried strengths. Each also contained weaknesses. None explained everything. And in homicide investigations, unanswered questions matter. The media occasionally reignited public interest. Anniversaries brought renewed headlines. Television stations aired retrospective segments. Newspaper reporters interviewed retired detectives whose memories remained astonishingly vivid. Many could still recall the crime scene in extraordinary detail. The weather, the silence, the expressions on fellow officers' faces. Experienced homicide detectives often remember unsolved murders more clearly than solved ones. Solved cases eventually reach a conclusion. Unsolved ones remain unfinished conversations. Publicity generated another wave of telephone calls. Some came from people convinced they had remembered something important. Others simply wanted to share rumors heard years earlier. Anonymous letters occasionally arrived. Some contained elaborate theories. Others identified supposed suspects without supporting evidence. Investigators treated every communication seriously. Most led nowhere. Occasionally, one justified additional interviews. Even false information sometimes produced useful investigative opportunities. One recurring challenge involved distinguishing genuine recollection from reconstructed memory. Years after a notorious crime, communities develop collective narratives. People unconsciously absorb details from newspapers, conversations, documentaries, and local folklore. Eventually, they begin remembering events they never actually witnessed. Detectives remained acutely aware of this phenomenon. Every statement required careful verification. Could it be corroborated? Did independent evidence support it? Or had memory quietly merged with public storytelling? Meanwhile, advances in forensic preservation quietly increased optimism. Evidence collected decades earlier had survived. That fact alone distinguished Pamela's investigation from many other unsolved homicides. Some agencies during earlier eras lacked standardized preservation procedures. Items were discarded. Storage conditions varied. Documentation occasionally proved incomplete. In Pamela's case, investigators believed important materials remained available for future examination. That mattered enormously, because forensic science continued evolving at remarkable speed. Techniques unimaginable in 1970 gradually became routine. Laboratories achieved greater sensitivity. Smaller samples produced meaningful results. Investigators who once relied almost exclusively upon eyewitnesses increasingly turned towards scientific evidence. Science possesses no memory, no bias, no fear. If properly collected and preserved, evidence simply waits. The possibility that science might eventually answer questions witnesses could not remain a constant source of cautious optimism. Pamela's family also continued waiting. Waiting became part of daily life. Years transformed into decades. Parents grew older. Friends built careers and families. Class reunions occurred without one familiar face. Former classmates occasionally gathered and inevitably found themselves discussing the same question. What really happened? Some admitted they still thought about Pamela unexpectedly. passing the old school, driving familiar roads, seeing photographs from another era. Certain tragedies permanently attach themselves to places. Even newcomers eventually learn the stories. Communities remember. Not perfectly, but persistently. Law enforcement leadership changed repeatedly over the years. New police chiefs inherited old promises. District attorneys reviewed dormant files. Cold case investigators received specialized training unavailable to earlier generations. Many departments across America established dedicated units responsible solely for unsolved homicides. These investigators possess one significant advantage. They weren't distracted by today's crimes. Their focus remained entirely on yesterday's unanswered questions. Pamela's murder belonged precisely to that category. The file was methodically digitized. Paper reports converted into searchable records. Photographs scanned at higher resolution. Evidence inventories updated. Names entered into modern databases. Technology did not solve the crime. It made the investigation more accessible. Connections once buried beneath thousands of pages could now emerge more quickly. Investigators also explored whether overlooked relationships existed between individuals previously considered unrelated. Social circles, employment histories, residential proximity, shared acquaintances, vehicles, travel patterns. Modern analytical software allowed comparisons impossible during the original investigation. Still, no decisive breakthrough emerged. The absence of immediate success did not discourage experienced detectives. Cold case work rewards persistence more than speed. Sometimes years of effort produce nothing. Then one laboratory report changes everything. One witness remembers. One family member speaks. One offender confesses to someone they trust. History repeatedly demonstrates that silence is rarely permanent. The question is not whether people keep secrets. They do. The question is whether they can keep them forever. Investigators quietly believe someone, somewhere, possessed information they had never shared. Perhaps because they feared involvement. Perhaps because they never recognized its importance. Perhaps because loyalty outweighed conscience. Or perhaps because the person carrying the secret was the offender himself. Time affects everyone differently. Some grow more comfortable with deception. Others become increasingly burdened by it. Criminal investigations have been solved by deathbed confessions, unexpected diary entries, forgotten photographs, chance conversations, relatives discovering old possessions. The smallest discovery can illuminate decades of darkness. That possibility kept Pamela's investigation alive. Not active every day, but never abandoned. Every preserved document represented unfinished work. Every photograph represented unfinished justice. Every anniversary reminded detectives that somewhere beyond the carefully organized evidence room, the complete story still existed, whether concealed inside aging forensic evidence awaiting new scientific methods, hidden within a memory someone had long tried to suppress, or carried silently by an individual who believed the passage of time had guaranteed permanent anonymity. Investigators refused to accept that the truth had vanished. They believed it remained intact, waiting patiently for the moment when persistence, technology, and circumstance would finally converge. And when they did, even a mystery that had survived for decades might begin to unravel, one carefully documented fact at a time. Every unsolved homicide reaches a point where the investigation begins to resemble archaeology more than police work. Detectives are no longer searching for fresh footprints or warm leads. They are excavating the past, layer by layer, hoping that beneath decades of assumptions, forgotten conversations, and overlooked evidence lies the one fact capable of changing everything. Pamela Conyers' case had entered precisely that stage. It was no longer driven by urgency. It was driven by patience. The evidence room had become its own silent archive. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Boxes sat untouched for years before suddenly finding themselves beneath bright fluorescent lights once again. Labels written by detectives long retired remained attached to sealed envelopes, photographs, laboratory reports, handwritten notes, and interview transcripts. Every document represented hours of work by investigators who had once believed they were only days away from solving the murder. Those days have become decades. Yet one principle guided every cold case detective who reopened Pamela's file. Never assume your predecessors overlooked nothing. At the same time, never assume they overlooked everything. Respect the original investigation. Challenge its conclusions. That balance is far more difficult than it sounds. Young detectives entering the cold case unit approached Pamela's murder differently than those who had first responded in November 1970. They possess advantages earlier investigators could never have imagined: digital databases, sophisticated forensic laboratories, geographic mapping software, behavioral research accumulated through thousands of homicide investigations across the country. But they also faced disadvantages. They had never stood at the original crime scene. They had never heard the urgency in the first emergency calls. They had never interviewed witnesses while memories were still fresh. Instead, they inherited a case frozen in paper. Their challenge was reconstructing reality from records alone. The first step involved something deceptively simple. Read everything. Not summaries. Everything. Every detective who joined the review team was expected to study the original reports page by page. Marginal notes written decades earlier often contained observations that never appeared in formal summaries. A detective's instinct recorded in the corner of a notebook sometimes became surprisingly important years later. One handwritten sentence drew attention. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't highlighted. It simply questioned whether one witness had appeared unusually nervous during questioning. No accusation. No conclusion. Only an observation. Could nervousness mean guilt? Of course not. Witnesses become anxious for countless innocent reasons. But experienced investigators know something equally important. Behavior deserves context. If someone appears unusually uncomfortable during multiple interviews, if their timeline shifts repeatedly, if small details evolve over time, those changes deserve another look. The review team began constructing entirely new investigative charts, not because the original timeline was incorrect, because visualization often reveals relationships hidden inside paperwork. Names were connected, addresses plotted, employment histories compared, vehicle ownership examined, school friendships mapped. Modern investigative software transformed decades of scattered information into interconnected networks. Some links proved meaningless. Others raised eyebrows. A witness interviewed briefly during the original investigation had unknowingly crossed paths with another individual connected to an entirely different inquiry years later. Was it coincidence? Most likely. But coincidence has misled detectives before. Nothing would be dismissed without verification. While analysts worked inside headquarters, investigators returned to community. The neighborhood had changed dramatically. Trees planted decades earlier now towered above sidewalks. Old businesses had disappeared. New families occupied homes once owned by longtime residents. Children who had played outside in 1970 were now grandparents themselves. Many no longer lived there. Those who remained carried memories unlike anything preserved inside official files. Memory has texture. Reports contain facts. People remember feelings. They remembered helicopters, police cars lining the streets, the silence that settled across the neighborhood afterward, parents refusing to let children walk alone, schools ending extracurricular activities before dark. A generation had grown up under the shadow of one unanswered question: Several retired residents agreed to speak once more. The conversations were remarkably different from those conducted decades earlier. Age changes perspective. People who once worried about damaging reputations no longer cared. Old rivalries had disappeared. Friendships had faded. Some witnesses admitted they had been hesitant to speak openly during the original investigation because they feared becoming involved in a murder case. Others confessed they simply assumed someone else had already reported what they knew. That assumption has complicated countless homicide investigations. Everyone believes another witness will mention the important detail. Sometimes, no one does. One retired resident recalled seeing an unfamiliar vehicle in the area around the time investigators believed Pamela disappeared. The description wasn't precise. Too much time had passed. The color remained uncertain. The make uncertain. Even the year uncertain. Standing alone, the recollection possessed little evidentiary value. But investigators compared it against every vehicle reference documented inside the original file. Remarkably, a similar description appeared inside an interview conducted more than 50 years earlier. The original detectives had pursued the lead. Nothing had come from it. Still, two independent memories separated by decades had arrived at roughly the same observation. Enough to justify another review. Not enough to identify a suspect. Only enough to keep asking questions. Meanwhile, forensic specialists quietly continued examining preserved evidence. Modern laboratories operate with extraordinary precision. Microscopic particles invisible to earlier generations now carried investigative value. Fibers, trace materials, environmental contaminants, manufacturing characteristics. Tiny details previously impossible to distinguish became measurable. Each scientific advance encouraged detectives to submit older evidence for renewed testing. Sometimes laboratories reported exactly what investigators expected. Nothing new. Sometimes they uncovered additional information. Not necessarily enough to solve the case, but enough to narrow possibilities. Each result became another brick supporting or weakening existing theories. Technology also transformed communication between police agencies. Investigators no longer depended solely upon mail reports or telephone calls. National databases allowed comparisons involving thousands of criminal investigations. Names, vehicles, fingerprints, criminal histories, patterns. Connections invisible in 1970 became searchable within minutes. Analysts examined whether any known violent offenders operating throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states during that period could plausibly intersect with Pamela's final movements. Several names emerged. Each underwent careful review. Where had they lived? Where had they worked? Could they physically have been present? Did their criminal behavior resemble the known facts? One by one, possibilities were evaluated. One by one, many were eliminated. Some lacked geographic proximity. Others possessed verified alibis. Several committed entirely different categories of crimes with little behavioral overlap. Investigators resisted forcing unrelated offenders into Pamela's case merely because their names attracted public attention. Real investigations demand restraint. Coincidence cannot replace evidence. The family watched these developments cautiously. Hope had become complicated. Every announcement regarding renewed testing generated optimism. Every announcement that failed to produce an arrest reopened disappointment. Families living through unsolved homicide investigations often describe hope as exhausting. It never completely disappears. Neither does uncertainty. Every ringing telephone becomes significant. Every unfamiliar letter. Every news article mentioning advances in forensic science. Could this finally be it? Or would another year pass unanswered? The emotional burden cannot be measured. For detectives, the responsibility felt equally profound. Cold case investigators inherit promises made by people who may no longer wear a badge. Some original detectives had passed away. Others remained alive, following developments from retirement. Several continue receiving occasional telephone calls requesting clarification about handwritten notes or forgotten interviews. Remarkably, many remembered surprising details. Not every name, not every report, but certain moments never left them. The expression on a witness's face. A strange feeling after one interview. An unanswered question that had bothered them for years. Experience teaches investigators to trust evidence above instinct. Yet instinct often determines where evidence should be examined. The review expanded again. Financial records available from the era. Employment documents. Historical property ownership. Archived newspaper photographs. City directories. Telephone books. Documents most people would consider worthless suddenly acquired investigative importance. Each helped reconstruct life as it existed in 1970. Not life remembered. Life documented. The distinction mattered enormously. Memory changes. Records usually do not. One detective summarized the challenge during an internal briefing. We're trying to rebuild one ordinary day from half a century ago. An ordinary day. Until it wasn't. That single sentence captured the complexity of Pamela's murder. The day had begun like countless others. Students attended school. Parents went to work. Traffic followed familiar routes. People greeted neighbors. Nobody realized history was quietly unfolding around them. Only afterward did every ordinary moment acquire extraordinary significance. Investigators believe the answer still existed somewhere inside those ordinary moments. Someone had seen something, heard something, noticed something, perhaps without recognizing its importance. The passage of time had hidden the truth beneath thousands of unrelated memories. Their job was uncovering it, piece by piece, fact by fact, without assumptions, without shortcuts, without surrender. As another comprehensive review drew toward completion, the investigators found themselves in a familiar position. No dramatic confession had arrived. No eyewitness had suddenly identified a killer. No single document had transformed the case overnight. Yet the investigation no longer looked exactly as it had before. Small discoveries had accumulated. Old assumptions had been challenged. New forensic possibilities had emerged. Tiny fragments, individually insignificant, collectively intriguing, were beginning to suggest that the decades-long silence surrounding Pamela Conyers' murder might not be permanent after all. Somewhere within the growing network of preserved evidence, re-examined testimony, and advancing science, detectives sensed that the first faint outline of the truth was slowly beginning to emerge, even if they could not yet see the face hidden within it. Every cold case has a moment when the investigation stops looking backward and begins looking forward again. It is rarely dramatic. There are no flashing lights, no sudden confession, no detective racing through the night after an unexpected phone call. Instead, it begins quietly, inside a laboratory, around a conference table, or in the evidence room where boxes untouched for decades are opened with the same care as they were on the day they were first sealed. Pamela Conyers' murder had reached that moment. The detectives assigned to review understood something their predecessors could only hope for. The evidence collected in 1970 had survived. That fact alone separated Pamela's case from countless others. Across the country, many older investigations had suffered from missing exhibits, deteriorated materials, incomplete documentation, or preservation methods that reflected the scientific standards of another era. Entire homicide files had become impossible to re-examine because the physical evidence no longer existed. Pamela's investigation was different. Years earlier, officers had preserved far more than they realized would one day matter. Now, Every sealed package represented possibility. The cold case unit established a simple rule before reopening anything. Assume nothing. Every item would be examined as though investigators knew absolutely nothing about the crime. No theory would guide the science. The science would guide the theory. That distinction defined modern homicide investigations. One evidence technician later described the process as having a conversation with the past. Every envelope carried the handwriting of detectives who had long since retired. Every inventory sheet reflected decisions made under immense pressure. Every chain of custody record documented the journey of evidence through decades of storage. Nothing could be overlooked. Laboratory specialists began conducting detailed inventories. Clothing, personal belongings, photographs, trace evidence, recover materials, control samples. Every object was carefully documented before additional examinations were authorized. Technology had transformed forensic science beyond recognition. Analysts could now identify microscopic characteristics that earlier laboratories had been unable to measure. Tiny fibers could reveal manufacturing processes. Environmental particles could narrow locations. Biological traces once considered too limited for meaningful examination might now offer valuable investigative information. Each scientific advancement carried one important promise. Evidence does not become less truthful with age. If preserved correctly, it simply waits for better questions. Outside the laboratory, detectives focus on another challenge: information. The original investigation had generated thousands of pages of reports. Those reports contained names, addresses, employment records, witness interviews, investigative notes, newspaper references, and follow-up actions. In 1970, detectives searched through filing cabinets. Now, those same records were digitized, searchable, cross-referenced, instantly connected. A name mentioned only once inside an obscure interview could now be compared against hundreds of unrelated investigations within seconds. Patterns that once required months to identify emerged almost immediately. The review uncovered something investigators frequently encounter in decades-old cases. Not mistakes. Gaps. Questions left unanswered simply because investigators lacked the resources or technology available today. One interview referenced another person who had never been formally questioned, not because detectives ignored the lead, because at the time it appeared insignificant. The review team tracked down every available historical record connected to that individual: employment, residency, known associates, vehicle ownership, military service, travel history whenever possible. Nothing immediately connected the individual to Pamela's murder. Still, the exercise demonstrated an important principle. Old investigations deserve new curiosity. Another detective concentrated on geographic analysis. Modern mapping software reconstructed the community as it existed in November 1970. Historical aerial photographs, road networks, businesses, schools, vacant properties, construction sites. Everything investigators believe existed at the time of the crime. Understanding geography often explains criminal opportunity. Could an offender have approached unnoticed? Where might a vehicle have remained temporarily concealed? Which routes allowed rapid departure? How visible would someone have been after dark? Questions once answered through intuition now received analytical attention. The reconstruction revealed subtle details impossible to appreciate from handwritten maps created decades earlier. Visibility, travel times, traffic patterns, escape routes. Nothing identified a suspect, but detectives believe they better understood the environment in which the crime occurred. Behavioral analysts also revisited offender characteristics. not to create certainty, only probability. The offender likely made dozens of decisions before, during, and after the crime. Each decision reflected knowledge, confidence, experience, or fear. Did the offender know the area well? Did he understand local routines? Was the crime carefully planned? Or had opportunity unexpectedly presented itself? Behavior rarely answers every question. It often suggests where investigators should look next. Public interest quietly returned. A regional newspaper published a retrospective examining Pennsylvania's oldest unsolved homicide investigations. Pamela Conyers' murder occupied a prominent place. The article did not speculate. It presented verified facts. The victim, the investigation, the decades without answers. Most importantly, investigators included a renewed request. If anyone possessed information, no matter how insignificant it appeared, they should contact the department. Experience had taught detectives something remarkable. Cold case witnesses often emerge after publicity, not because they suddenly remember, because circumstances change, relationships end, promises lose meaning, fear weakens. One telephone call arrived several days after publication. The caller declined to provide a name. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. No accusation. No confession. Only a suggestion that detectives should review an individual whose behavior following the murder had always seemed unusual. Anonymous information occupies an uncomfortable place in criminal investigations. Sometimes entirely false. Sometimes extraordinarily valuable. Investigators documented every word, then quietly began verifying the details. The individual had indeed attracted limited attention during the original investigation. Nothing had linked him to the crime. No evidence. No eyewitness. No confession. Still, modern detectives believe the matter deserved another review. Background records unavailable decades earlier provided additional context regarding the individual's life. Nothing definitive emerged. Yet the review reinforced another important lesson. The original investigators had worked with incomplete information. Every historical investigation does. That reality encourages humility rather than criticism. Across America, similar cold cases had recently reached remarkable conclusions through advances in forensic genealogy and improved laboratory techniques. Detectives followed those developments carefully. Every successful investigation demonstrated that patience and preservation could overcome extraordinary spans of time. Still, they remained cautious. Scientific possibilities depended entirely upon the quality and quantity of available evidence. Not every case possessed suitable material. Investigators therefore avoided promising breakthroughs. Hope must never replace evidence. Meanwhile, Pamela's surviving relatives continued living with uncertainty that had become woven into daily life. For them, the investigation existed in two different times simultaneously. The murder had occurred decades earlier. The grief remained immediate. Photographs never aged. Memories never graduated from high school. Parents who lose children often describe time as permanently divided. Everything afterward becomes measured against what should have happened. Careers never begun. Families never created. Milestones forever imagined rather than experienced. Justice, they often explain, cannot restore those losses. It can only acknowledge them. Retired detectives occasionally attended departmental briefings concerning Pamela's case. They listened quietly while younger investigators presented digital reconstructions, forensic updates, and analytical findings impossible during the original investigation. Some smiled at the technology. Others admitted they wished such resources had existed in 1970. No one expressed regret over preserving evidence. That decision, made under difficult circumstances decades earlier, continued offering hope. One retired investigator addressed the team before leaving. "The evidence is telling the same story," he said. "We just have to learn how to hear it." Those words remained with the detectives long afterward. Every laboratory report, every witness interview, every archive photograph. The story had never changed. Only investigators' ability to understand it continued evolving. The review expanded once again. Detectives examined historical weather records from the night of the murder, sunset times, temperature, visibility, road conditions. Even seemingly minor environmental factors can influence witness observations, offender behavior, and estimated timelines. Nothing was considered too small. Criminal investigations succeed through accumulation rather than miracles. One verified fact, then another, then another. Eventually, separate pieces begin fitting together. Not because they suddenly changed, because investigators finally understand how they relate. The department also coordinated with specialists from outside agencies experienced in long-term homicide reviews. Fresh perspectives often identify investigative assumptions that have quietly survived for decades. Every conclusion required supporting evidence. Every recommendation underwent careful evaluation. No shortcut existed. No single expert possessed all the answers. The truth, if it remained recoverable, would emerge through collaboration. As months passed, the review transformed Pamela Conyers' case from an aging archive into an active investigation once more. Detectives still lacked the one answer everyone sought, the identity of the person responsible, but something important had changed. The investigation was no longer limited by the questions asked in 1970. It was now shaped by decades of accumulated knowledge, advancing forensic science, modern analytical tools, and investigators unwilling to accept that 50 years of silence meant the truth had disappeared. Somewhere within preserved evidence, forgotten records, and the memories of people who had quietly carried fragments of the past for a lifetime, they believed the final pieces still existed, waiting for the moment when persistence would succeed where time itself had failed. Cold cases are rarely solved because of a single dramatic discovery. Popular culture celebrates the surprise confession, the anonymous letter, the fingerprint that instantly identifies a killer. Reality is usually far less cinematic. Justice often advances one microscopic step at a time through the relentless accumulation of facts that, individually, seem almost meaningless. Pamela Conyers' investigation was beginning to follow that familiar path. No breakthrough had arrived. No suspect had been arrested. Yet the file looked very different from the one detectives had inherited years earlier. The review had become deeper, more disciplined, less dependent on assumptions, more dependent on evidence. Inside the cold case unit, one guiding principle had emerged above all others. Reconstruct the victim's world, not the killer's. Investigators realized they could not identify an unknown offender until they completely understood the environment in which Pamela had lived. Every relationship, every routine, every familiar location deserved another examination. Not because detectives believed those closest to her were responsible, but because the smallest overlooked interaction might explain how the offender crossed her path. The review expanded beyond police reports. School yearbooks were located. Archived newspapers were examined page by page. Historical city directories identified former residents. Old telephone books helped reconstruct neighborhoods exactly as they existed in 1970. Investigators searched through property ownership records, attempting to determine who lived near Pamela's daily routes, who had recently moved into the area, and who disappeared shortly after the murder. Patterns matter, especially when viewed across decades. One detective described the process as assembling an enormous mosaic. No single tile tells you anything, but enough of them together, and the picture begins to appear. Meanwhile, retired officers continued sharing memories unavailable anywhere else. Official reports recorded facts. Veteran detectives remembered instincts. One recalled interviewing a witness whose answers had always felt rehearsed. Another remembered spending hours searching an isolated area after receiving an anonymous tip that ultimately proved false. A third remembered an individual who had volunteered information before detectives even asked certain questions. None of those recollections proved guilt. Experienced investigators understood that intuition could never replace evidence. Still, instinct often determines where investigators choose to look next. Every observation was documented. Nothing was accepted simply because someone remembered it. Everything required verification. One aspect of the investigation became increasingly important. Time. Specifically, time between the last confirmed sighting and the discovery of the crime. Every minute mattered. Investigators reconstructed travel times using historical speed limits, traffic patterns, and contemporary road maps. They calculated how long it would have taken to drive from one location to another in November 1970. They considered weather conditions, sunset, available lighting, and even condition of roads that no longer existed. The purpose was straightforward: reduce uncertainty. The narrower the timeline became, the smaller the universe of possibilities. Modern investigative software transformed handwritten witness statements into searchable data. Every location, every vehicle, every name, every estimated time. Cross-referenced, compared, visualized. The computer identified relationships that would have required months of manual work during the original investigation. Most proved insignificant. Some deserved closer attention. One recurring name surfaced across multiple witness interviews. Not as a suspect, simply as someone present in different conversations. The individual had been interviewed years earlier. Nothing connected them directly to the homicide. Even so, detectives reviewed the interview again. Then again. The statements remained generally consistent. No obvious deception. No contradiction substantial enough to justify suspicion. Still, the review reinforced a valuable lesson. Every investigation contains people who orbit the crime without necessarily participating in it. Separating coincidence from significance remains one of homicide investigation's greatest challenges. As forensic science continued evolving, laboratories developed methods capable of extracting information from increasingly limited biological material. Detectives consulted forensic specialists regarding every preserved exhibit connected to Pamela's case. Could additional testing be performed? Had technology improved enough to justify re-examination? Would the evidence withstand modern laboratory procedures? Each recommendation required careful evaluation. Evidence is finite. Some testing consumes samples permanently. Investigators therefore approached every decision cautiously. One opportunity lost could never be repeated. The laboratory team emphasized preservation above speed. Better to wait for the appropriate methodology than risk destroying valuable material prematurely. That philosophy demanded patience. Cold case investigators possessed patience in abundance. Outside the department, public fascination with unsolved murders had grown considerably. Television documentaries, investigative podcasts, newspaper retrospectives. Across the country, decades-old cases once considered impossible were reaching unexpected conclusions. Families watched those stories with cautious optimism. Detectives did too. Each successful prosecution demonstrated that time alone does not protect offenders. Science continues advancing. People continue talking. Evidence continues waiting. Pamela's family remained careful whenever speaking publicly. They welcomed renewed attention to the case, but avoided speculation. Their message remained remarkably consistent throughout the years. They wanted facts, not rumors, not sensational theories. not public accusations unsupported by evidence. Only the truth. That restraint earned respect from investigators. Public pressure can complicate homicide investigations. Families demanding immediate arrests sometimes unintentionally encourage speculation that weakens legitimate inquiries. Pamela's relatives understood something essential. An incorrect accusation creates another victim. Justice requires certainty. Nothing less. Within the cold case unit, analysts revisited every known vehicle associated with investigative leads. Registration histories, ownership transfers, insurance records were available, historical addresses. Some vehicles had long since been destroyed. Others had passed through multiple owners over decades. Even so, documenting their movements sometimes clarified older witness statements. One vehicle previously believed unrelated was found to have been in another location entirely during the relevant period. Another possibility quietly disappeared. Elimination is progress, though it rarely feels like it. Investigators often solve cases not by discovering who committed the crime, but by systematically proving who did not. The pool narrows. Possibilities shrink. Eventually, one explanation survives. Behavioral specialists also revisited offender risk. The murder required decisions. Approach. Control. Departure. Concealment. Each stage exposed the offender to potential observation. Why accept those risks? Did the offender feel confident because he knew the area? Because he had offended before? Or because he believed circumstances favored him? Every answer generated competing theories. None could be accepted without supporting evidence. That discipline protected the investigation from confirmation bias. A dangerous temptation in every long-running case. Detectives must constantly resist falling in love with their own theories. Evidence leads. Investigators follow. Never the reverse. As years passed, another reality became increasingly unavoidable. If the offender remained alive, advanced age alone could dramatically alter investigative possibilities. Former associates might now speak more openly. Family members might discover forgotten documents. Old photographs stored in attics might unexpectedly acquire significance. Personal diaries, letters, employment files. Small fragments of ordinary life sometimes become extraordinary evidence decades later. Several investigators contacted historical societies and local archives, searching for photographs of the neighborhood taken around 1970. Not crime scene photographs. Ordinary photographs. Community events. Parades. School activities. Street festivals. Background images occasionally reveal vehicles, buildings, signage, or people never documented elsewhere. Most produced nothing useful. One or two help verify how certain locations appeared at the time. Again, tiny progress, but progress nonetheless. The emotional weight inside the investigation remained constant. Every detective assigned to Pamela's case understood they were working against two relentless forces: time, and mortality. Witnesses continued aging. Some passed away before investigators could interview them again. Retired officers died. Family members disappeared. Every year permanently removed another source of potential information. The urgency therefore returned, not because the crime had become newer, but because opportunities were quietly vanishing. One senior investigator summarized the challenge during an internal meeting. The evidence gets older, so do the people. We can't stop either. Those words reshape priorities. Interviews with elderly witnesses accelerated. Historical records were digitized before deterioration made them unreadable. audio recordings transferred into modern formats. Every effort focused on preserving information before it disappeared forever. The investigation had become more than a search for a killer. It had become a race against history itself. Yet despite the enormous challenges, optimism slowly returned. Not public optimism. Professional optimism. The kind built upon experience. Across the United States, investigators had watched impossible cases fall one after another. Murders 30 years old, 40 years old, even older, solved because someone refused to stop asking questions. Pamela Conyers' homicide still lacked its defining answer, but it no longer lacked direction. The investigation possessed renewed momentum. Evidence had survived. Technology continued improving. Witnesses remained willing to speak. Most importantly, detectives had not surrendered to the comforting belief that some murders simply cannot be solved. Because history repeatedly demonstrates exactly the opposite. Some murders wait. Quietly. Patiently. For decades. Until science, persistence, and circumstance finally intersect. As another exhaustive review reached its conclusion, investigators found themselves standing closer to the truth than they had been at any point in years, not because they possessed a suspect they could identify publicly, nor because they had uncovered one spectacular piece of evidence, but because dozens of small discoveries had begun fitting together with increasing precision. The case was no longer defined solely by what remained unknown. It was increasingly shaped by what investigators could now prove, eliminate, verify, and preserve. Somewhere beyond those carefully assembled facts, hidden behind more than half a century of silence, the final answer still waited. And for the first time in a very long time, detectives believed that answer might finally be within reach. The investigation had now reached a stage that few people outside law enforcement ever witnessed. There were no press conferences announcing dramatic developments, no flashing cameras, no detectives standing behind podiums promising imminent arrests. Instead, progress unfolded behind secure doors, inside forensic laboratories and conference rooms where every sentence was measured carefully because one careless assumption could undo years of meticulous work. For Pamela Conyers' case, the objective had become remarkably clear. Separate certainty from possibility. The original investigation had inevitably produced both. Detectives in 1970 worked under extraordinary pressure. Every witness statement, every anonymous telephone call, every rumor circulating through the community demanded attention. Some information proved reliable. Much of it did not. Half a century later, the review team approached the file with one advantage their predecessors never possessed: distance. Time had stripped away the urgency that often forces investigators to chase every lead immediately. Now, each piece of information could be judged against decades of accumulated evidence. The result was revealing. Entire theories quietly disappeared, not because they had been disproven overnight, because careful review demonstrated they had never rested upon solid evidence in the first place. One frequently repeated rumor had survived for years despite having almost no investigative support. Another theory, widely discussed within the community, originated from a misunderstanding repeated so often that many residents eventually accepted it as fact. Neither belonged inside a criminal investigation. Detectives removed speculation from the equation. Only documented facts remained. That process alone transformed the case. Investigators frequently describe cold case reviews as cleaning a window covered by decades of dust. The landscape beyond the glass has never changed. Only the ability to see it clearly improves. Pamela's investigation benefited enormously from that philosophy. Every witness interview received a reliability assessment. What had the witness personally observed? What had they merely heard? Which details were recorded immediately after the crime? Which appeared years later? The distinction mattered. First-hand observation carries weight. Rumor does not. Memory also received careful scrutiny. Psychological research conducted over the decades had fundamentally changed investigators' understanding of eyewitness testimony. People rarely lie intentionally. Instead, memory quietly changes. Faces become confused. Dates shift. Conversations merge together. New information subtly reshapes old recollections. Detectives therefore treated confidence cautiously. Someone absolutely certain after 50 years might actually remember less accurately than someone admitting uncertainty. Evidence, not certainty, guided conclusions. Meanwhile, forensic specialists continued reviewing preserved materials using methods unavailable when Pamela was killed. Every examination followed strict scientific protocols. No shortcuts, no assumptions. Analysts documented every observation independently before comparing conclusions. Objectivity remained essential. Cold cases carry enormous emotional weight. Science cannot. Science answers only one question. What does the evidence demonstrate? Nothing more. Nothing less. Outside the laboratory, investigators pursued another avenue increasingly important in long-term homicide investigations: historical reconstruction. Communities evolve continuously. Roads widen. Buildings disappear. Businesses relocate. Neighborhoods change. What appears obvious today may have been impossible 50 years earlier. Using archived aerial photographs, engineering records, newspaper images, and municipal planning documents, investigators recreated the physical environment surrounding Pamela's final known movements. The exercise revealed subtle but meaningful details. Sight lines differed from modern conditions. Certain structures once blocked visibility. Vacant lots had since become residential developments. Trees now towering above sidewalks had been small saplings. Road lighting had changed dramatically. Understanding the original landscape helped detectives evaluate witness accounts more accurately. Could someone really have seen what they claimed? Would traffic noise have concealed a struggle? How visible would an unfamiliar vehicle have appeared? Questions impossible to answer confidently without historical context suddenly became measurable. The reconstruction also reminded investigators how much ordinary life had surrounded extraordinary violence. School buses followed familiar routes. Local businesses closed at predictable hours. Families gathered for dinner. Children played outside. Nothing about that day announced a tragedy approaching. Criminal investigations often reveal a painful truth. History rarely announces itself while it is happening. Only afterward does every ordinary detail become significant. Pamela's classmates had grown older. Many had built successful careers, raised families, retired. Some agreed to additional interviews despite understanding they might contribute nothing new. Several expressed the same emotion: regret, not personal guilt. Simply regret that they had never been able to help investigators identify whoever ended Pamela's life. One former classmate recalled the atmosphere inside school following the murder. Hallways unusually quiet. Teachers struggling to continue lessons. Students glancing repeatedly toward empty desks. The murder had transformed adolescence into something far more complicated. Safety no longer seemed guaranteed. The community had lost more than one young woman. It had lost innocence. Detectives listened carefully, not because emotional recollections identify offenders, because they provide context. Understanding the victim's world often illuminates opportunities previously overlooked. The review also extended into archived criminal intelligence. Investigators examined historical reports involving violence against young women throughout the broader region. They searched for similarities: behavior, geography, victimology, opportunity. Many cases appeared superficially alike. Very few survived detailed comparison. Experienced homicide investigators understand that coincidence frequently imitates criminal patterns. Only evidence establishes genuine connections. Several promising comparisons ultimately dissolved after forensic review. Different offender behavior, different circumstances, different timelines. Again, elimination represented progress. One by one, investigators narrowed possibilities. Attention increasingly focused upon individuals whose documented histories placed them within realistic proximity to Pamela during the relevant period. Importantly, detectives avoided public speculation. The investigation had already endured decades. Another unsupported accusation would serve no one. Professional discipline demanded restraint. Only evidence could justify identifying someone publicly. Anything less risked damaging innocent lives while weakening the credibility of the investigation itself. Advances in digital record systems also allowed analysts to compare historical information more comprehensively than ever before. Employment histories, driver registrations, military records were legally accessible, property ownership, business licenses. Each database contributed another small piece. None independently solved the crime. Together, they gradually reduced uncertainty. Investigators often compare homicide investigations to assembling a 1,000-piece puzzle. The comparison is imperfect. A puzzle box shows a finished picture. Criminal investigations do not. Detectives build the image without knowing what it ultimately looks like. Only when enough pieces connect does the truth begin revealing itself. Pamela's family remained informed whenever investigators considered developments significant enough to share. Those conversations required extraordinary sensitivity. Hope had accompanied previous reviews. Some produced meaningful discoveries. None had yet produced justice. Investigators therefore refused to create unrealistic expectations. Better to promise little and deliver certainty than promise certainty and deliver disappointment. The family appreciated that honesty. They understood the investigation remained active because detectives believed evidence still possessed untapped value. Retired investigators occasionally visited the department, curious about modern techniques unavailable during their careers. Many expressed admiration rather than frustration. They recognized that every generation of detectives inherits the strengths and limitations of its era. The officers who first investigated Pamela's murder had worked tirelessly with the tools available to them. Their careful preservation of evidence allowed future investigators opportunities they themselves never enjoyed. That continuity represented one of law enforcement's greatest strengths. Cases outlive careers. Justice often becomes a multi-generational effort. Inside the laboratory, analysts completed another series of examinations. Results entered the investigative file. Some confirmed earlier findings. Others refined them. None justified immediate public announcements. Still, the cumulative effect became increasingly important. Investigators were no longer merely preserving history. They were actively reshaping their understanding of it. The file growing thicker no longer reflected confusion. It reflected clarity. Old assumptions removed. Verified facts strengthened. Uncertainty gradually confined to smaller and smaller areas. That process demanded patience beyond ordinary comprehension. Weeks became months. Months became years. Yet every completed review reduced the distance separating investigators from the truth. One detective summarized the investigation during an internal strategy meeting. We don't need hundreds of new answers. We need one correct one. That statement captured the essence of every successful cold case investigation. Most evidence already exists. Most witnesses have already spoken. The challenge lies in recognizing which overlooked fact changes the meaning of everything surrounding it. As another year passed, Pamela Conyers' murder no longer resembled the stagnant cold case many imagined. Behind the scenes, the investigation had evolved into one of the department's most carefully reconstructed historical homicide inquiries. Detectives had stripped away decades of rumor, preserved every viable piece of evidence, rebuilt the crime scene through historical records, re-examined witnesses with modern investigative techniques, and positioned the case to benefit from scientific advances unimaginable in 1970. They still lacked the one answer the family had waited a lifetime to hear, but the silence surrounding the case was no longer empty. It was filled with evidence being reconsidered, questions being asked again, and investigators increasingly convinced that somewhere within the painstaking reconstruction of one ordinary November day, the final path toward the truth was beginning to reveal itself. The longer a murder investigation remains unsolved, the more dangerous assumptions become. Time has a way of polishing theories until they begin to resemble facts. Detectives know better. Every cold case review begins with the same uncomfortable realization. What everyone believes may not be what the evidence actually proves. That realization shaped every decision made during the latest review of Pamela Conyers' murder. Nothing was immune from reconsideration. Not the timeline. Not the witness statements. Not the physical evidence. Not even the questions investigators have been asking for decades. Sometimes the greatest obstacle to solving an old case is not the lack of evidence. It is the weight of tradition. One detective described it bluntly during an internal strategy session. If we've been asking the wrong question for 50 years, the right answer has been impossible to find. The room fell silent, because everyone understood the implication. Perhaps investigators had focused too heavily on identifying a suspect. Perhaps they first needed to identify opportunity. Who could realistically have crossed paths with Pamela during the narrow window established by the investigation? Not who seemed suspicious. Not who attracted rumors. Who was actually capable of being there? That shift changed everything. Analysts rebuilt the timeline minute by minute. Every confirmed sighting received a confidence rating. Every estimated time was distinguished from documented fact. Every uncertain detail was clearly labeled. Gradually, the window narrowed. Certain possibilities quietly disappeared. Others became more plausible. The investigation had become less about speculation and more about probabilities supported by evidence. Meanwhile, another group of detectives concentrated on historical records that had rarely been examined in depth. Employment rosters, business directories, utility records, archived newspaper advertisements, construction permits, city planning documents. At first glance, none appeared connected to homicide. Yet experienced investigators understand something many people overlook. Crimes occur within ordinary life. Ordinary life leaves records. A business opening early. A delivery route. A maintenance crew working nearby. A temporary road closure. Any seemingly routine activity might explain why someone happened to be in a particular place at a particular time. The review uncovered several details that help investigators better understand the community as it existed in late 1970. Not breakthroughs. Context. And context often changes interpretation. A witness once believed to have observed unusual activity may simply have described normal traffic for that hour. Another witness previously dismissed as unreliable now appeared more consistent when compared against reconstructed travel times. Evidence rarely changes. Perspective does. Forensic specialists continued their methodical work. Every preserved exhibit had now undergone multiple layers of examination over the years. Advances in laboratory technology allowed increasingly sensitive analysis. Yet detectives remained careful not to overstate scientific capability. Technology cannot create evidence that never existed. It can only reveal information hidden inside evidence already preserved. That distinction remains central to the investigation. Every laboratory report was reviewed not in isolation, but alongside witness testimony. historical documentation, and behavioral analysis. No single discipline would solve Pamela's murder. Only the convergence of multiple independent findings could provide the confidence required for criminal prosecution. Investigators also revisited anonymous communications received throughout the decades. Boxes containing letters and signed notes and records of anonymous telephone calls filled several folders. Many had already been discounted. Some clearly reflected local gossip. Others contained details readily available through newspaper coverage. Still, detectives believed every communication deserved another review. Occasionally, anonymous tips reveal information only the offender, or someone close to the offender, could have known. Analysts carefully separated publicly available facts from details withheld during the investigation. Most communications failed that test. A small number remained intriguing, not because they identified a suspect, because they demonstrated knowledge difficult to explain. Those communications received renewed attention. Every effort was made to determine whether the information originated from first-hand knowledge or coincidence. The process was painstaking, necessary, unavoidable. Elsewhere, investigators continued interviewing individuals whose lives had intersected with Pamela's community decades earlier. Some conversations lasted only minutes. Others extended for hours. Age had changed people. Many no longer feared discussing events they once considered too sensitive. Some admitted they had avoided police in 1970 simply because they were young and intimidated by authority. Others confessed they assumed what they knew was unimportant. One former resident recalled seeing police activity before learning what had happened. Another remembered conversations among neighbors that revealed how frightened the community had become almost overnight. None of these recollections identified the killer, but together they reconstructed an atmosphere impossible to capture inside official reports. Fear changes communities. Routine disappears. Parents become cautious. Children become watchful. Trust erodes. Pamela's murder had altered daily life long after investigators left the crime scene. The review also benefited from improvements in information sharing among agencies. Modern investigators could compare historical records across jurisdictions with remarkable efficiency. Cases once isolated inside county filing cabinets now existed within searchable national systems. Analysts searched for offenders whose documented movements overlapped geographically and chronologically with the investigation. Again, possibilities emerged. Again, most were eliminated. Every elimination mattered. Investigators were not collecting suspects. They were removing impossibilities. Eventually, only realistic possibilities remain. Behavioral experts contributed another layer of analysis. They revisited offender decision-making without attempting to construct sensational profiles. Instead, they focused on observable behavior. The offender approached. The offender acted. The offender departed. Each stage required choices. Every choice involved risk. Did those risks suggest familiarity with the location? Confidence? Desperation? Opportunity? Behavior alone could never identify a name. It could identify investigative priorities. That distinction guided every recommendation. The victim's family remained remarkably patient throughout the renewed investigation. After so many years, patience had become second nature. Yet patience should never be mistaken for acceptance. The absence of answers remained painful. Every anniversary, renewed questions no family should carry for a lifetime. Friends and classmates continued remembering Pamela, not as a case number, but as the teenager they once knew. To investigators, maintaining that perspective mattered enormously. Cold case files would become overwhelming. Thousands of pages, hundreds of names, countless reports. It becomes dangerously easy to focus only on paperwork. Experienced detectives deliberately return the photographs of the victim, not for emotion, for a purpose. Every report exists because one human life ended violently. Justice requires never losing sight of that reality. One younger investigator later admitted that studying Pamela's school photographs affected him profoundly. She looked exactly like countless students he passed every morning on his way to work. The realization reinforced why cold case investigations matter. Time changes evidence. Time changes witnesses. Time changes investigators. It does not change the value of the victim's life. Inside the department, optimism remained cautious. Detectives avoided predicting outcomes. History had taught them humility. Many promising investigations collapsed unexpectedly. Others advanced after years of complete silence. No experienced homicide investigator declares victory before the evidence speaks. Yet one undeniable fact distinguished the current review from every earlier effort. The investigation was stronger, more organized, more thoroughly documented. Every assumption challenged. Every surviving theory supported by evidence rather than speculation. The case had evolved from an aging collection of reports into a carefully reconstructed historical investigation built upon modern forensic standards. That transformation alone represented enormous progress. Whether it would ultimately identify the offender remained uncertain. But uncertainty no longer implied stagnation. It reflected honest investigation. Late one evening, after most personnel had left headquarters, a detective remained inside the evidence room, reviewing Pamela's file yet again. The shelves around him held hundreds of unsolved cases, each representing another family still waiting for answers. He understood that statistics offered little comfort. Some investigations would never reach a courtroom. Some offenders would never face a jury. But experience had also taught him something impossible to ignore. Every year, somewhere in America, another decades-old murder once believed unsolvable suddenly found its answer, not through luck, but through persistence, careful preservation of evidence, advancing science, and investigators unwilling to mistake the passage of time for the end of the search. Pamela Conyers' case still stood on that uncertain threshold, balanced between history and justice, between silence and truth, with every new review bringing detectives one deliberate step closer to understanding what had really happened on the day a community lost one of its own. More than 5 decades had passed since the murder of Pamela Conyers, yet the investigation remained defined by a simple, relentless principle. Every unanswered question deserved another attempt. Time had transformed nearly every aspect of American criminal investigation. Patrol cars carried computers. Crime laboratories operated with technologies that investigators in 1970 could scarcely have imagined. Information crossed state lines in seconds instead of weeks. But despite all those changes, the purpose remained exactly the same. Identify the truth. Nothing more. Nothing less. Inside the department, Pamela's case had become something larger than a single investigation. It had become a lesson. Young detectives assigned to the cold case unit were encouraged to study the file not merely because of its historical significance, but because it demonstrated the discipline required to investigate an unsolved homicide. Every report illustrated careful documentation. Every preserved exhibit reflected the foresight of investigators who understood that evidence might someday speak in ways they could not yet imagine. That lesson mattered, because the original detectives had never stopped believing the case could eventually be solved. They simply knew they might not be the ones to solve it. Justice sometimes spans generations. One investigator retires. Another inherits the file. Years later, someone else continues the work. The badge changes. The mission does not. During the latest review, detectives focus on one recurring objective: verification. Old information could no longer survive simply because it had existed inside the file for decades. Every significant fact required confirmation. Addresses, employment histories, witness locations, vehicle ownership. Travel records were available. Each element of the investigation had to withstand modern scrutiny. Some historical assumptions remained accurate. Others quietly disappeared. Investigators welcome both outcomes. Good police work values correction over pride. A theory proven wrong is not failure. It is progress. One analyst spent weeks reviewing historical mapping data alongside archived municipal records. Road construction, street lighting, commercial development, property boundaries. Small environmental details often influence criminal opportunity far more than people realize. An alley illuminated today may have been completely dark decades earlier. A busy intersection may once have been an isolated road. Understanding those differences allowed detectives to evaluate witness testimony more realistically. Could someone truly have observed a passing vehicle? Would visibility have allowed identification? How long would a person have remained exposed before disappearing from view? Questions that once depended largely on estimation now received far more precise analysis. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining preserved evidence using the most current forensic standards available. Every laboratory submission followed the same philosophy. Let the evidence speak before investigators do. Science does not negotiate. It does not speculate. It simply measures, compares, documents. The detectives understood that even negative laboratory findings possess value. Knowing what evidence does not reveal often narrows the investigation as effectively as discovering something new. Each completed examination reduced uncertainty. Slowly, patiently, methodically, outside headquarters, public interest in historical unsolved cases continued growing. Journalists occasionally contacted the department requesting updates. Investigators remained careful. Protecting the integrity of the investigation required restraint. Certain details remained confidential, not to create mystery, to preserve the possibility that future interviews could distinguish genuine knowledge from information already circulating publicly. Experienced homicide investigators understand the importance of information control. A person who volunteers details never released publicly immediately attracts attention. Conversely, someone repeating newspaper coverage contributes little. Every word matters. Every omission matters. The victim's family appreciated that discretion. After decades of waiting, they understood the difference between publicity and progress. Attention alone would not solve Pamela's murder. Evidence might. They continued cooperating whenever investigators requested assistance, answered questions about family history, clarified small details from the past, and supported renewed efforts without demanding conclusions unsupported by facts. That quiet cooperation became one of the investigation's greatest strengths. Cold case work depends upon trust. Trust between detectives. Trust between laboratories. Trust between investigators and families. Without it, even the strongest evidence becomes difficult to present effectively. One afternoon, the review team gathered around a conference table covered with documents accumulated during months of analysis. There were no dramatic announcements. Instead, investigators discussed elimination. One possible timeline eliminated. Another interpretation strengthened. Several witness statements reclassified according to reliability. Behavioral observations updated. Historical records reconciled. Viewed individually, none of those decisions appeared remarkable. Viewed together, they represented years of disciplined work. The case was becoming clearer, not simpler. Clearer. The distinction mattered. Complex investigations rarely become easy. They become better understood. As understanding improves, possibilities decrease. The universe of unanswered questions grows smaller. One detective remarked that solving old murders often resembles sculpting rather than building. The truth already exists. Investigators simply remove everything that cannot be true. What remains must withstand examination. Behavioral specialists also revisited one persistent issue: opportunity. Who realistically possessed the opportunity to encounter Pamela during the relevant period? Not according to rumor, not according to local gossip, according to verified chronology. Opportunity alone does not establish guilt. Thousands of innocent people possess opportunity every day. But without opportunity, guilt becomes impossible. The review therefore concentrated on establishing realistic boundaries instead of expanding speculation. That disciplined approach prevented the investigation from drifting toward sensationalism. Another important development involved the preservation of institutional knowledge. Several retired detectives agreed to record formal interviews describing aspects of the investigation never fully reflected inside official reports. Not hidden evidence. Professional observations. Investigative reasoning. Challenges encountered during the original inquiry. Future investigators would therefore inherit more than paperwork. They would inherit experience. That effort reflected another lesson learned from decades of cold case investigations across the country. Memory eventually disappears. Documentation endures. Everything worth preserving was preserved. The investigation also highlighted the importance of collaboration. No single detective possessed every answer. No laboratory solved the case independently. Historians reconstructed communities. Forensic scientists analyzed evidence. Behavioral specialists evaluated offender actions. Investigators interviewed witnesses. Prosecutors reviewed legal standards. Each discipline contributed another piece. Modern homicide investigations succeed through cooperation rather than individual brilliance. Pamela's case demonstrated that principle repeatedly. As another anniversary approached, community members quietly remembered the young woman whose future had been stolen. Some visited cemeteries. Others shared memories with younger relatives who had never known her. Teachers mentioned the case while discussing local history. Not to inspire fear. To remind students that every victim deserves to be remembered as a person rather than merely an unsolved mystery. That distinction remained deeply important. Pamela was not simply a headline, not merely an evidence file. She had been a daughter, a classmate, a friend, a teenager with plans interrupted by violence. Investigators never lost sight of that reality. Every review of the case began with her photograph, not because emotion solves crimes, because purpose sustains investigations through years of uncertainty. Late in the review process, detectives compared every verified finding produced during the latest examination against the earliest investigative conclusions reached in 1970. The comparison proved illuminating. Some original observations had aged remarkably well. Others reflected understandable limitations imposed by contemporary science. Far from criticizing their predecessors, the review reinforced respect for them. They had preserved evidence carefully, documented observations thoroughly, recorded interviews comprehensively. Without that foundation, modern investigators would have possessed far fewer opportunities. Justice, they realized, had become a shared effort across generations of law enforcement. One generation collected, another preserved, another re-examined. Another might ultimately identify the truth. That possibility continued motivating everyone involved. No one could predict when, or even whether, the decisive piece of evidence would emerge. But detectives understood something history had demonstrated repeatedly. Cold cases often appear unchanged right until the moment they change forever. A laboratory result, a newly located record, a witness willing to speak, a previously overlooked connection. The breakthrough almost always seems obvious only after it happens. Until then, it hides quietly among ordinary facts. As the latest phase of the investigation concluded, Pamela Conyers' murder no longer stood merely as an unsolved crime from 1970. It had become one of the department's most carefully reconstructed historical homicide investigations, strengthened by decades of preservation, modern forensic analysis, renewed witness reviews, and an unwavering commitment to separating evidence from speculation. The final answer had not yet emerged, but the distance between the known and the unknown had narrowed considerably. Detectives understood they were not chasing rumors anymore. They were following verified facts, one after another, toward a truth that had remained concealed for more than half a century. And they believed that if the evidence continued to be examined with the same patience and discipline that had sustained the investigation for generations, the silence surrounding Pamela Conyers' final hours might not endure forever.